The surgeon paused as he pulled back my hospital gown. His eyes locked onto the skin of my right hip, and all the color drained from his face. He leaned in close, his breath trembling, and whispered, "Is this a flaw?" I froze. Those were the exact words my sister always used to describe that mark. Before I could even ask him what he meant, his hand shook and the metal scalpel slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against the stainless steel tray. He just stood there, staring at the 40-year-old star-shaped hyperpigmentation on my hip like he had just seen a ghost. What happened next in that hospital room would unravel a 4-decade-long web of stolen children, corporate theft, and a betrayal so deep it almost cost me my empire. My name is Vivian, and I am 62 years old. Before I continue this story, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to fight tooth and nail to protect everything you built from greedy family members who only know how to take. This journey is a heavy one, but I promise you the payoff is worth every single step. The sterile cold of the pre-op room at Atlanta General Hospital seeped through my thin paper gown. I was sitting there prepped for what was supposed to be a routine biopsy. At my age, you do not take chances with your health, especially when you have an entire legacy riding on your shoulders. I am the founder and sole owner of Soul Legacy, a multi-million-dollar Southern culinary empire that I built from the ground up. I started with a single rusted-out food truck selling oxtails and collard greens on street corners and turned it into a nationwide brand. My surgeon for the day was Dr. Marcus Davenport. Marcus is 40 years old, a brilliant top-tier surgeon, and the man I helped raise as my nephew. I had always loved Marcus like my own flesh and blood. He was the golden boy of the Davenport family, smart, capable, and usually cool under pressure. But right now, looking at my birthmark, he was anything but cool. "Marcus," I said softly, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. "What is wrong? Why did you say that?" He backed away from the table, his eyes darting frantically between my face and the mark on my hip. "Aunt Vivian," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have the exact same mark on my back. My mother always told me it was just a flaw, a birth defect. How do you have the exact same?" Before Marcus could finish his sentence, the heavy double doors of the pre-op room burst open violently, hitting the wall with a loud bang. The sudden noise made both of us jump. The sterile quiet was instantly shattered by the clacking of designer heels against the linoleum floor. In walked my older sister, Rochelle. Rochelle is 60 years old, but she spends half my dividends trying to look 40. She was dressed in an obnoxious, bright red pantsuit, looking like she was heading to a cocktail hour rather than visiting her sister in a hospital. Right behind her was Chloe. Chloe is Marcus's 35-year-old white wife. She comes from one of those old money country club families that always look down their noses at people like me. Chloe was dripping in Chanel head to toe, wearing a quilted leather bag and oversized sunglasses indoors. Every single designer thread on her body was paid for by the very soul food empire she constantly mocked in private. They did not look worried. They did not ask about my health or the biopsy. They marched straight toward my bed with a disturbing kind of purpose. Rochelle did not even look at the medical equipment hooked up to my arm. She slammed a thick leather-bound clipboard down right on my lap. "Sign it!" Vivian Rochelle demanded, her voice sharp and echoing in the small room. I looked down at the clipboard. The bold black letters at the top of the document read, "Medical power of attorney and full operational proxy." My heart began to pound against my ribs. I looked up at my sister, narrowing my eyes. "What is the meaning of this, Rochelle?" I asked, keeping my tone dangerously calm. "I am here for a minor biopsy, not a heart transplant. Get this paper off my lap." Rochelle let out a dry, condescending laugh. "Do not play dumb with me, Vivian. You have been running Soul Legacy into the ground ever since Daddy died. You are making terrible business decisions. You are refusing to franchise the way we want, and your memory is clearly slipping. You are going senile, and I am not going to let you drag the family wealth down with your aging mind. Sign the proxy. Let us take over before you ruin everything." The sheer audacity of her words made my blood boil. Family wealth. I ripped the clipboard off my lap and tossed it onto the floor. "Are you out of your mind?" I snapped, my voice rising with every word. Family wealth, Rochelle. There was no family wealth until I created it. I built that entire empire from a hot, greasy food truck while you were blowing Daddy's life insurance money at the blackjack tables in Vegas. You spent your youth chasing bad men and cheap thrills while I was burning my hands on fryers working 18-hour shifts to put a roof over your head. You do not own Soul Legacy. You do not run Soul Legacy. You just leech off it. Chloe stepped forward, rolling her eyes with that signature privileged sigh she always used when dealing with me. She crossed her arms, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the harsh hospital light. "Oh, please, Vivian." Chloe drawled, her tone dripping with fake pity. "Stop living in the past with your little street food sob story. The corporate world is changing, and quite frankly, your ghetto mom and pop mentality is holding the brand back. We need corporate restructuring. We need modern leadership. You are too old and too unstable to see the bigger picture. Just sign the document so we can manage the company properly." I glared at Chloe. "You watch your mouth, little girl," I warned her. "You love calling my business ghetto, but you sure do love spending that ghetto money at the luxury boutiques, do you not? You have not worked a hard day in your life. Neither of you have the authority to step foot in my boardroom, let alone demand my signature. Now get out of my hospital room before I call security." Rochelle smirked, stepping closer to the bed. Her eyes were cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of sisterly love. "You always were stubborn, Vivian, but you do not have a choice anymore." Chloe pulled out her sleek gold smartphone from her Chanel bag, tapping the screen with a manicured nail. She did not look angry. She looked triumphant. Her lips curled into a cruel, satisfied smile. "It really does not matter if you sign the proxy today," Vivian Chloe said, her voice light and musical, like she was discussing the weather. "What are you talking about?" I demanded, feeling a sudden icy dread twist in my stomach. Chloe held up her phone, displaying an email with the official Soul Legacy corporate letterhead. "The board of directors held an emergency morning meeting an hour ago," she explained smoothly. "They already voted to freeze your operational accounts and suspend your executive powers. You are officially locked out of the company, Vivian." I stared at her in disbelief. "The board cannot do that without legal cause," I countered. "I am the majority shareholder. They cannot just remove me without a medically verified reason." Chloe chuckled, exchanging a victorious look with Rochelle. "Oh, but they have a medically verified reason, Vivian. The board received a formal sealed evaluation this morning. They suspended you based on the preliminary dementia and cognitive decline diagnosis submitted by your own attending physician." The room went dead silent. The hum of the hospital monitors seemed to fade away. I slowly turned my head to look at Marcus. Marcus was standing by the medical tray, his face completely ashen. He looked at his mother, then at his wife, his mouth slightly open in pure, unadulterated shock. He slowly shook his head, his hands trembling at his sides. "I never made that diagnosis," Marcus whispered, his voice cracking in the sterile air. "I never signed any evaluation." The sterile air in the room suddenly felt thick and suffocating. I stared at Marcus as his words hung in the space between us. He had never signed any evaluation. He had never diagnosed me with dementia. The sheer weight of that truth crashed into me like a runaway freight train. I looked from my nephew, who was trembling beside the surgical tray, over to my sister Rochelle and her smug daughter-in-law Chloe. The pieces of their disgusting puzzle were rapidly falling into place. They had orchestrated a corporate coup while I was sitting in a hospital gown waiting to be cut open. The sheer evil of it made my stomach churn. I had sacrificed my entire youth to build a legacy that would lift our family out of poverty. I spent nights sleeping on flour sacks in the back of my first commercial kitchen, just so Rochelle could have a warm bed and new shoes for high school. And this was my repayment. A calculated knife in the back delivered by the very people who ate from the table I built. I felt a sudden surge of heat rush through my veins. The adrenaline completely drowned out the coldness of the room and the fear of my upcoming medical procedure. I reached over with my left hand and grabbed the plastic tubing of the IV line hooked into my right arm. Without hesitating for a single second, I yanked the needle straight out of my vein. A sharp sting flared in my arm, and a small stream of bright red blood trickled down my skin, staining the crisp white hospital sheets. But I did not care. I threw the plastic tubing onto the floor. "I am not having this surgery today," I announced, my voice steady and dark, with an anger I had not felt in decades. I swung my legs over the edge of the hospital bed, my bare feet hitting the cold linoleum floor with a heavy thud. Marcus took a step forward, his hands raised as if trying to calm a wild animal. "Aunt Vivian, please, you are bleeding," he stammered, his eyes wide with panic. "You need to calm down and let me bandage that." I ignored his medical concern and stepped right up to him. "Look me in the eyes, Marcus," I commanded, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous octave. "Did you or did you not evaluate my cognitive functions last month?" Marcus shook his head vigorously, looking genuinely horrified. "I swear to you, Aunt Vivian, I did not. I would never do that to you. You are as sharp as you have always been." I turned my head slowly to glare at Chloe. She was standing there, clutching her expensive designer bag, but the victorious smirk had finally vanished from her face, replaced by a flicker of nervous energy. It was then that I saw Marcus follow my gaze. I watched the horrible realization wash over his face. He remembered the stack of blank medical letterheads he kept in his home office desk. He remembered Chloe constantly asking about my health and my private business affairs over dinner. He knew his wife had full access to his professional seal and his secure digital signature. "Chloe, you forged my signature," Marcus said, his voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and growing rage. "You used my medical credentials to file a fake diagnostic report to the board of directors." Chloe took a step back, her eyes darting between me and Marcus. "Do not be ridiculous, Marcus," she scoffed, but her voice lacked its usual arrogant confidence. "Your mother and I just gathered the necessary documentation to protect the family assets. We did what had to be done because you were too emotionally attached to make the hard choices for the company. You committed federal medical fraud." I corrected her, taking a heavy step closer to the spoiled woman who thought she could steal my life work. "You forged a doctor's signature to execute a hostile takeover of a multi-million-dollar company. I am going to see you both in prison for this." Rochelle lunged forward, grabbing Chloe by the arm and pulling her toward the door. "We are leaving," Rochelle declared, her voice shrill with sudden panic. "You are clearly having a psychotic break, Vivian. The board made the right decision locking you out. Come on, Chloe, we do not need to subject ourselves to this madness anymore." But I was not about to let them walk away with my company. I grabbed my regular clothes from the chair and shoved past them, pushing the heavy hospital room doors wide open. The bright fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor blinded me for a second, but I kept moving, following them out into the crowded hallway. I was a 62-year-old woman, but in that moment, I possessed the furious strength of a cornered lioness. "Give me that proxy document, Rochelle," I demanded, raising my voice so it echoed down the busy ward. Nurses and orderlies stopped in their tracks, turning their heads to watch the unfolding drama. "I am calling my lawyers and I am calling the police right now. You are not taking Soul Legacy from me. You will not steal my life from me." Chloe realized in that exact moment that her carefully laid out plan was rapidly crumbling. The quiet corporate theft she had envisioned was turning into a massive public spectacle, and I had the evidence of her forgery walking right behind us in the form of her own husband. She needed a distraction, and she needed it immediately. So Chloe resorted to the oldest and most dangerous trick in her extensive playbook. She stopped dead in the middle of the crowded hospital hallway and let out a piercing, terrified scream. Her face crumbled into an expression of absolute agony and fear. Tears began streaming down her perfectly contoured cheeks almost instantly. She clutched her chest and backed away from me as if I were holding a loaded weapon. "Help us," she sobbed loudly, her voice cracking with manufactured terror. "Please, somebody help us. She is delusional and aggressive. Protect us." She pointed a trembling finger right at me. A 62-year-old black woman standing in a thin paper hospital gown with fresh blood dripping down her bare arm. The narrative of the room shifted in the blink of an eye. The curious murmurs in the hallway changed from quiet whispers to panicked, frantic voices. Chloe fell against the wall, sliding down slightly, as if she was too weak to stand hyperventilating, and crying out for protection from the big, angry black woman. It was a performance worthy of an Academy Award, and it worked exactly the way she intended it to. Heavy footsteps pounded down the corridor. 3 large hospital security guards in dark blue uniforms rushed past the nurse station, heading straight for our commotion. Their eyes immediately bypassed the weeping white woman and locked right onto me. "Ma'am, you need to step back," one of the guards commanded, reaching out and grabbing my uninjured arm with a forceful bruising grip. "Calm down right now, or we will have to physically restrain you." "Let go of me," I barked, trying to pull my arm out of his tight grasp. "I have done nothing wrong. These two women just stole my company and forged medical records." But they were not listening to me. Why would they listen to the loud, aggressive patient when there was a fragile, weeping woman cowering against the wall? A second guard moved in, grabbing my other arm and pressing me roughly against the side of a heavy metal medical cart. The cold steel dug sharply into my back. I felt a massive wave of absolute humiliation wash over me. I had spent 40 years building an empire, employing hundreds of people in the local community, donating millions to neighborhood development programs, and acting as a pillar of strength for my city. I was a respected business owner, a philanthropist, and a mentor. And yet right here in this sterile hallway, none of that mattered. I was being treated like a violent criminal in a public place, all because my greedy sister wanted my bank accounts and her spoiled daughter-in-law knew exactly how to weaponize her fake distress. The racial dynamics of the situation were glaringly obvious, and Chloe was playing them like a master pianist. "Take your hands off her right now!" A booming voice echoed through the corridor. It was Marcus. He shoved his way through the gathering crowd of onlookers, his white doctor coat billowing behind him. His eyes were blazing with an intensity I had never seen before. The security guards hesitated, but did not immediately let me go. "Dr. Davenport," one of the guards said, looking incredibly confused, "this patient is acting aggressively toward these visitors. She is clearly a danger to herself and others." I said, "Take your hands off my patient." Marcus ordered, his voice echoing with absolute, unquestionable authority. "There is no threat here. These two women trespassed into a private preoperative area and caused severe emotional distress to a patient awaiting surgery. Release her immediately, or I will have both of your badges stripped by the end of this shift." The guards looked at each other, then slowly released their firm grip on my arms, stepping back submissively. Marcus stood directly between me and the guards, acting as a physical shield. He turned his head to look at his mother and his crying wife. His face was a mask of pure, total disgust. "Get out of this hospital," Marcus told them, his voice ice-cold and deadly calm. "Do not come back to this floor. Do not ever speak to my aunt again." Rochelle grabbed Chloe by the shoulders, pulling her up from the floor. Chloe instantly stopped crying, her tears drying up the very second she realized her performance was no longer working. She glared at Marcus, a look of pure, unadulterated hatred flashing in her eyes. "You will regret this," Marcus, Rochelle hissed, fixing her expensive wig before turning on her heel. "You just chose the wrong side." They marched down the hallway, their designer heels clicking furiously against the floor, leaving a massive trail of destruction in their wake. The hallway slowly began to clear as the nurses ushered the gaping onlookers back to their rooms. I stood there shivering in my torn hospital gown, feeling the blood drying on my skin. I felt completely, entirely broken. My life work was frozen, my sister was trying to destroy me, and the only family I had left was the man whose wife just signed my corporate death warrant. Marcus turned to face me. He looked much older somehow, as if the traumatic events of the last 10 minutes had aged him an entire decade. He gently took my bleeding arm and pressed a clean piece of white gauze against the open wound. We stood there in silence for a moment, breathing in the heavy, sterile air. Then, without saying a single word, Marcus reached into the breast pocket of his white coat. He pulled out a small, thick paper rectangle. It was his personal medical business card. He checked to make sure none of the lingering nurses were watching us before pressing the card firmly into the palm of my hand. His fingers lingered over mine for a second, squeezing tightly in a silent, unspoken promise. Security had tried to restrain me, but Marcus stepping in had changed everything. I turned the card over in my hand. There was something written on the back in hurried, messy blue ink. My heart began to pound a new, frantic rhythm against my chest. The message was short, but it carried the extreme weight of a 40-year-old secret, a dark, painful secret I thought I had buried along with my soul all those years ago in a sketchy, downtown clinic. I squinted to read his handwriting under the harsh hospital lights. The message sent a violent shiver straight down my spine. Meet me at the old brownstone. Bring your medical records from 1986. The rain was pouring down in heavy, thick sheets across the dark streets of Atlanta as I pulled my car up to the old family brownstone. This was the house my father bought back in the late 70s, long before the massive wealth and the corporate empire of Soul Legacy came into our lives. It was supposed to be a safe haven for our family, but tonight it felt like a cold, empty tomb. I sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, listening to the rhythmic thud of the windshield wipers. I clutched a faded yellow folder tight against my chest. Inside were my medical records from 1986. My mind was racing with a million frantic questions. Why did Marcus want these old files? Why was he completely ignoring the hostile corporate takeover of my company? Why did seeing my birthmark cause him to drop a scalpel in the middle of a preoperative room? I took a deep breath, stepped out into the freezing rain, and walked up the cracked concrete steps. I pushed the heavy wooden front door open and stepped into the hallway. The house was completely dark, except for a single dim lamp burning in the old study at the end of the hall. I found Marcus standing silently by the brick fireplace. He looked absolutely exhausted. His broad shoulders were slumped, and he had taken off his pristine white doctor coat. I tossed the yellow folder onto the heavy oak desk between us. I looked him in the eyes and said, "There are the medical records you asked for, Marcus. Now can we please talk about how your wife and my sister just committed grand larceny and stole my life work from right under my nose?" But Marcus did not even look at the folder. He did not say a single word about Soul Legacy or the board of directors or the fake dementia diagnosis. He just stared at me with those deep brown eyes that suddenly looked so incredibly familiar to me. He pointed at the worn leather chair behind me and told me to sit down. He said, "We are not talking about the company right now, Aunt Vivian. We are talking about what happened to you in the summer of 1986. We are talking about your pregnancy." The breath completely left my lungs. I felt a cold, sharp pain strike the dead center of my chest. Of all the things I expected him to say tonight, that was the absolute last. I stood up perfectly straight and crossed my arms defensively over my chest. My voice shook with a toxic mixture of raw, ancient grief and sudden, fierce anger. I asked him why on earth he would bring up the most painful experience of my entire life on a day like today. I told him that my baby boy died at birth, and he already knew that story. I told him that it was a closed chapter of my life, and it had absolutely nothing to do with Chloe freezing my business bank accounts today. But Marcus did not back down. He stepped closer to me and demanded that I tell him exactly what happened at that clinic 40 years ago. He said, "I need to hear it from your own mouth, Vivian. I need you to tell me every single detail about the day you supposedly lost your son." I felt the hot, heavy tears welling up in my eyes, but I absolutely refused to let them fall down my face. I am a strong black woman, and I have spent 4 decades building an impenetrable armor over that specific wound. I raised my voice and told him that I was 22 years old and completely terrified. I was working 3 exhausting jobs just trying to get my very first food truck business off the ground. The father of my baby vanished into thin air the second I told him I was pregnant. I was entirely alone and terrified of what our strict father would do if he found out. Then Rochelle stepped in perfectly, playing the role of the caring older sister. Rochelle told me she found a private clinic downtown that would handle the delivery quietly and safely. She promised me the doctors there were top tier and that Daddy would never have to know the messy details of my out-of-wedlock pregnancy until I was fully ready to tell him. I paced around the dim study, feeling the terrible old trauma rising thick in my throat. I told Marcus how Rochelle drove me to that sketchy clinic in the middle of the night when the severe labor contractions started. The place did not look like a proper hospital at all. It was small and poorly lit, and the nurses completely avoided making eye contact with me. I remember the severe, agonizing pain and the blinding, harsh lights of the delivery room. I remember pushing until I genuinely thought my heart would stop beating in my chest. And then I heard it. I told Marcus as my voice finally broke that I heard my baby cry. It was a strong, beautiful, healthy cry. But then the nurse quickly injected something cold into my intravenous line. My vision went blurry instantly, and the room started spinning out of control. The very last thing I saw before I passed out was Rochelle walking out of the delivery room holding a tiny bundle wrapped securely in a soft blue blanket. When I finally woke up 2 days later, Rochelle was sitting by my hospital bed holding my hand and crying fake tears. She told me the baby had suffered severe respiratory failure. She told me my beautiful little boy did not make it. I begged them to let me see his tiny body so I could hold him just once and say goodbye. But Rochelle and the clinic doctor firmly stated it was against health protocol and that they had already disposed of the remains to aggressively spare me the emotional trauma. I was young and broke and completely spiritually broken. I believed them because she was my own sister, and I trusted her with my life. Marcus stood completely still in the shadows listening to my tragic story. A single tear rolled slowly down his dark cheek. He reached down without saying a word and slowly unbuttoned his dress shirt. He pulled the fabric completely off his broad shoulders and turned his back to me. He pointed his finger to the right side of his lower back just above his hip. He told me to look at it. He told me to look very closely at the skin there. I stepped forward, my hands trembling so uncontrollably I could barely feel my fingers. Right there on his dark skin was the exact same mark I had on my own hip, a distinct star-shaped hyperpigmentation, a rare genetic birthmark that absolutely no one else in our entire family possessed. My mind tried violently to reject what my own eyes were seeing. The room began to spin just like it did in that terrible delivery room 40 years ago. Marcus turned around to face me, his shirt hanging loosely from his hands. His voice was incredibly thick with emotion, but laced with a terrifying, icy clarity. He said, "Rochelle never had a child, Vivian. She faked her entire pregnancy from start to finish. She stuffed heavy pillows under her expensive dresses and went away to a luxury retreat for 6 months while you were working yourself to the bone in the hot Georgia sun. When you went into labor, she took you to that shady clinic because she had already aggressively paid off the doctor and those silent nurses. She stole your baby, Vivian. She stole me." I fell backward into the heavy leather chair, desperately gasping for air. The horrifying realization hit me with the devastating force of a physical blow. Rochelle did not just steal money from my company today. She had stolen my only living child 40 years ago. But why, I asked, sobbing uncontrollably into my hands? Why would she do something so unspeakably evil to her own flesh and blood? Marcus walked over to the desk and pulled out a thick, legally bound document. It was a certified copy of my late father's original will. He flipped directly to the 3rd page and pointed at a specific highlighted clause. He said, "Because of this, read what Grandpa wrote before he died." I wiped my burning eyes and stared at the dense legal jargon. My father was a traditional harsh man who deeply believed in old-school patriarchy and male dominance. The clause clearly stated that the firstborn male grandchild would automatically inherit a massive $2 million trust fund upon turning 18 years old. My father created that specific rule to ensure the family name carried significant financial power for generations. Rochelle intimately knew about this clause. She knew that since I was pregnant with a boy, my child would inherit the massive fortune that she desperately wanted to completely control. She could not get pregnant herself because of her wild lifestyle, so she orchestrated the most demonic plan imaginable. She took my innocent son, claimed him as her own flesh and blood, and secured the $2 million bag for herself. She raised my actual son while treating me like absolute dirt on her shoes. A massive, blinding, violent rage ignited deep in my soul. It was a dark kind of anger I had never experienced in my entire 62 years of life. The sadness evaporated completely, replaced by a burning desire for absolute destruction and vengeance. I stood up so fast that the heavy leather chair tipped over backwards, crashing onto the hardwood floor. I grabbed my purse from the desk and frantically pulled out my cell phone. I told Marcus that I was calling the police right this exact second. I told him I was going to call the Federal Bureau of Investigation and every local news station in Atlanta. I was going to have Rochelle forcefully dragged out of her $1 million mansion in handcuffs while her country club friends watched. I was going to watch the authorities lock her in a cold, dark cage where she belonged for kidnapping, medical malpractice, and child abduction. But before I could dial the very first number, Marcus reached out and grabbed my hand. His grip was incredibly strong, and his brown eyes were completely devoid of the panic he had shown earlier at the hospital. He had completely transformed from a shocked victim into a cold, calculating, brilliant surgeon ready to perform a highly lethal operation. He said, "No, Vivian, do not make a single sound. Put the phone down right now." I tried aggressively to pull my hand away, screaming that she kidnapped him and completely ruined our lives. I demanded immediate severe justice right then and there. But Marcus did not let go. He looked me dead in the eyes and spoke with absolutely chilling precision. He explained that if we strike right now, Rochelle will just get a tiny slap on the wrist. He told me that the statute of limitations for the specific crimes committed in 1986 had likely fully expired in this state. The shady clinic doctor was probably dead, and the illegal facility had been permanently shut down decades ago. Rochelle would simply hire top-tier expensive lawyers and claim it was an informal, agreed-upon family adoption. She would spin a nasty web of lies saying I was a young, unfit mother, and she heroically stepped in to save the child. She would aggressively drag my good name through the mud in civil court and entirely avoid serious prison time. She would still keep her huge mansion and her fake friends and her stolen generational wealth. Marcus slowly let go of my hand and picked up the fake medical evaluation his wife had forged. He tapped the crisp paper with his index finger. He said, "We are not going to send her to a comfortable county jail for an old crime she can easily lie her way out of. We are going to send her to a maximum security federal prison for the massive crime she is aggressively committing right now." I stopped fighting him and listened very carefully. Marcus clearly laid out the grim reality of the current situation. Chloe and Rochelle were currently using his illegally forged signature to completely seize control of Soul Legacy. They were actively moving company assets and attempting a highly illegal hostile takeover across state lines. They were completely blinded by their own massive greed and foolish arrogance, genuinely thinking they had completely neutralized me as a threat. Marcus said, "Let them falsely think they are winning Aunt Vivian. Let them sit proudly in the boardroom and sign those documents. Let Chloe eagerly transfer the large sums of money. Let them joyfully commit massive, undeniable federal fraud. Grand larceny wire fraud and high-level corporate espionage all carry mandatory minimum sentences in federal prison. There is absolutely no statute of limitations protecting them from what they are doing right now. If we patiently let them walk right into the massive legal trap they are currently building, they will freely hand us all the solid evidence we need to destroy them permanently." I looked deeply at the strong young man standing bravely before me. He had my quiet determination, my sharp business mind, and my totally unyielding spirit. For 40 lonely years, I honestly thought I was entirely alone in this cold world, fighting endlessly against a family that hated my guts. Now I clearly realized my absolute greatest ally was my own stolen son. We had been cruelly robbed of a beautiful lifetime together, but they could not rob us of our sweet, impending revenge. I slowly lowered my phone and put it carefully back into my purse. I reached out and placed my trembling hand gently on his cheek, feeling the true warmth of my child for the very first time in 40 long years. I nodded my head in total agreement. I told him we would play their nasty game. We would smile while they stole from us, and we would patiently wait for the perfect moment to drop the heavy guillotine right on their necks. The heavy iron gates of the Davenport estate slowly swung open as Marcus pulled his luxury car into the long, sweeping driveway. He sat behind the wheel for a moment, taking a deep breath to steady his racing heart. He had to play the absolute hardest role of his entire life tonight. He had to walk into that massive house and pretend he did not know his wife was a corporate thief and his mother was a literal kidnapper. He parked his car and walked through the grand front doors into the massive marble foyer. Chloe was already waiting for him in the lavish living room, pouring herself a glass of incredibly expensive red wine. She was wearing a flowing silk robe, and her face was flushed with lingering anger from the hospital confrontation earlier that afternoon. As soon as Marcus walked into the room, she slammed her wineglass down on the crystal coffee table, spilling dark red liquid onto the pristine white rug. She immediately started yelling at him, her voice echoing sharply off the high vaulted ceilings of the mansion. She demanded to know why he had humiliated her in front of the hospital staff and defended that crazy old woman. Marcus kept his face completely blank, tightly clenching his fists inside his pockets to stop his hands from shaking. He told Chloe he had to intervene because hospital security was involved, and creating a public police scene would ruin their overall corporate strategy. He smoothly lied, telling his wife that he was only protecting their long-term financial interests by de-escalating the situation before the local news stations got a hold of the story and ruined the brand reputation. Chloe scoffed loudly, but seemed to slowly accept his logical explanation. She walked over to her designer leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of financial documents. She tossed them onto the table with an arrogant smirk, completely dropping her fragile victim act. She told Marcus he needed to stop being so soft because they were on the verge of securing generational wealth for their own family. She poured herself another massive glass of wine and proudly revealed her absolute master plan to her husband. Chloe explained that she was not just locking my aunt out of the boardroom to manage the daily operations of the company. She had already established a complex network of offshore accounts and a domestic shell company registered under her wealthy white family's corporate umbrella. She called the new entity Heritage Holdings and told Marcus she was going to systematically funnel all the liquid assets from Soul Legacy into this new shell company under the completely legal guise of aggressive corporate restructuring. She laughed a cruel, heartless laugh, saying that by the time the board of directors realized what was actually happening, my culinary empire would be completely bankrupt, and her family would legally own every single recipe, trademark, and real estate property I had ever purchased. Marcus listened to his wife proudly detail her massive federal crime, feeling absolutely sick to his stomach, but he forced himself to nod and agree with her brilliant financial strategy. He knew he had to let her build her own prison cell, brick by brick. 2 days later, Chloe decided to violently twist the knife even deeper to publicly secure her new position of power. To celebrate her impending hostile takeover, she organized a massive, incredibly lavish dinner party at her sprawling mansion. She invited all of the wealthiest, most influential socialites and corporate executives in the entire city of Atlanta. She wanted to publicly establish herself as the brilliant new face of the Southern culinary world, while completely erasing my decades of hard work and cultural impact. I did not receive an invitation to this grand celebration, but Marcus made sure to secretly text me the exact time and location of the event. He also told me exactly what Chloe was planning to serve to her wealthy guests to mock my heritage. When I arrived at the massive estate that evening, I did not knock or wait for the valet to open my door. I pushed right past the private security guards at the front entrance, wearing a stunning tailored black pantsuit and my absolute best string of real pearls. I walked straight down the long hallway and into the grand dining room, where 30 of Atlanta's most elite citizens were seated around a massive mahogany table. The room was dripping in excessive wealth, with huge crystal chandeliers hanging above and massive white floral arrangements blocking the view across the table. Chloe was standing proudly at the head of the table, wearing a ridiculously expensive white gown and holding a tall glass of expensive champagne. She was right in the middle of giving a loud, arrogant speech to her wealthy guests. She was actively mocking my life work, telling the wealthy crowd that Soul Legacy had survived for years on purely ghetto street food recipes that were dripping in unhealthy grease and outdated cultural trauma. She proudly announced that she was personally elevating the brand for a more refined, sophisticated palate, moving away from its humble, embarrassing origins. I looked down at the expensive china plates in front of the guests and felt a massive wave of absolute disgust wash over me. She had taken my famous, rich, savory oxtail stew and replaced it with a pale, unseasoned, tough piece of boiled meat floating in a clear, tasteless broth. She had completely ruined my legendary collard greens, serving them raw and chopped up like a bitter, dry garden salad, without a single ounce of seasoning or smoked meat. It was a complete culinary insult designed specifically to humiliate me and strip the actual soul right out of my beloved soul food. The entire dining room went completely dead silent the exact moment they noticed me standing in the large arched doorway. Several of the wealthy guests shifted uncomfortably in their expensive seats, immediately recognizing me as the true founder of the massive company Chloe was currently trashing. Chloe stopped mid-sentence, her fake, confident smile freezing completely on her pale face. Her eyes widened in genuine panic as I slowly and deliberately walked into the dining room. She immediately opened her mouth to call for her private security guards, but I did not give her the chance to speak or play the victim. I calmly walked right over to the nearest empty chair at the massive dining table and gracefully sat myself down. I did not scream or yell or throw a bitter, angry tantrum like she desperately wanted me to do. I simply picked up a heavy silver spoon from the pristine table setting and dipped it into the pale, tasteless broth sitting in the expensive china bowl in front of me. Every single pair of eyes in that massive dining room watched me in stunned, breathless silence, waiting for an explosive confrontation. I lifted the silver spoon to my mouth and took a slow, deliberate sip of the completely ruined recipe. It was absolutely terrible, lacking any depth or flavor or history whatsoever. It tasted exactly like Chloe looked bland, privileged, and completely empty inside. But I did not spit it out or make a face of disgust. I swallowed the terrible, unseasoned food gracefully placed, the silver spoon back onto the table, and looked directly down the length of the long table at my terrified daughter-in-law. I gave her a warm, sweet, incredibly polite smile that completely terrified her right down to her core. I told her in a loud, clear voice that her new elevated culinary direction was certainly very unique and ambitious. I praised her for her bold, unseasoned choices, telling the confused wealthy guests that Chloe always had a very distinct creative way of handling other people's hard-earned assets. Chloe stood there, completely paralyzed, holding her tall champagne glass so tightly her knuckles were turning bright white under the chandeliers. She had fully expected me to lose my temper and validate her fake narrative that I was a crazy, aggressive old black woman losing her mind. My total, calm, absolute composure completely shattered her entire dramatic performance. I slowly stood up from the heavy wooden chair, carefully smoothing down the front of my tailored black pantsuit. I told the wealthy guests to please enjoy their exceptionally bland dinner and began to walk gracefully toward the grand exit. But just before I reached the arched doorway, I paused and slowly turned back around. I reached into my designer leather handbag and pulled out a single thick manila folder. I walked slowly back toward the head of the table where Chloe was standing, completely frozen, in absolute fear. I gently placed the heavy folder right next to her plate of ruined, unseasoned food, making sure all the guests saw me do it. I leaned in very close so only she could hear my low, steady voice, and whispered that I brought her a little housewarming gift to officially celebrate her brand-new corporate venture. I turned my back to her and confidently walked out of the massive dining room, the rhythmic clicking of my sharp heels echoing loudly in the completely silent mansion. Chloe immediately dropped her crystal champagne glass onto the polished table, splashing the expensive beverage absolutely everywhere. Her hands violently trembled as she frantically reached out and ripped open the thick manila folder I had left behind. Sitting right on top of the stack of papers was an official certified document printed on heavy government letterhead. It was a formal binding notification directly from the Internal Revenue Service. It stated clearly that her secret new shell company, Heritage Holdings, was currently under a massive comprehensive federal audit for suspected offshore tax evasion and high-level corporate wire fraud. Her pale face drained of all remaining color as she realized her brilliant master plan was already completely destroyed, and the real game had just begun. The morning after the disastrous dinner party, my house was completely quiet. I was sitting on my back porch drinking a cup of hot black coffee and watching the sun rise over my massive garden. The cool morning breeze felt incredibly refreshing against my skin. For the very first time in weeks, I felt a genuine sense of peace washing over me. I knew the Internal Revenue Service audit notice I left for Chloe would cause an absolute earthquake inside their little corporate bubble. I was fully expecting a massive reaction, but I did not expect them to totally panic. It was barely 8 in the morning when I heard the loud, aggressive screeching of car tires pulling into my long, circular driveway. I did not even have to look over the balcony to know exactly who it was. Heavy, angry footsteps pounded against the wooden planks of my front porch, followed by a frantic, violent pounding on my heavy mahogany front door. I took one last slow sip of my coffee, placed the ceramic mug on the small glass table, and walked calmly out through my massive living room to answer the door to face my very evil, greedy sister. The second I turned the brass lock and pulled the heavy door open, Rochelle forcefully pushed her way past me and barged right into my foyer. She looked absolutely terrible. Her expensive designer clothes were deeply wrinkled. Her usually perfect hair was a messy, tangled bird nest, and her face was completely pale with pure, unadulterated panic. She was breathing heavily like she had just run a marathon, holding a thick black leather briefcase tightly against her chest. "Are you completely out of your mind, Vivian?" she screamed at the absolute top of her lungs, her voice echoing very loudly. "What exactly did you do last night?" she demanded. "Chloe is in my office right now having a total nervous breakdown. We just got a massive federal notice that the government is aggressively auditing our very entire new corporate structure. Do you have any idea what you have just done to this family?" I calmly closed the front door behind her and leaned casually against the polished wood. I looked my frantic sister up and down, feeling absolutely no sympathy for the panicked monster standing in my foyer. I told her I had absolutely no idea what she ever meant. I reminded her that they were the brilliant corporate minds who locked me out of my own company, so they should be more than capable of handling a simple government inquiry. Rochelle dropped her heavy briefcase onto my entryway table with a loud thud. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger right at my face and told me to completely drop the innocent act. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out the forged medical proxy document she had aggressively shoved in my face at the hospital just a few days ago, waving it violently like a very massive weapon. "You think you are so smart, Vivian," she hissed maliciously. "But you are just a pathetic old woman losing her absolute mind. If you do not call off your very high-powered government contacts and make this federal audit disappear right now, I am going to use this proxy today. I am going to call a private ambulance and have you forcibly removed from this house. I will have you permanently institutionalized in a psychiatric facility before the sun goes down. I will tell the doctors you are a severe danger to yourself, and I will leave you entirely, completely broken. I will leave you rotting in a padded room for the rest of your miserable life," she screamed. Her terrifying threat hung heavily in the quiet air of my home. Decades ago, those hateful words would have completely broken my spirit, but today, they just made me want to laugh right in her desperate face. I dared her to bring the paramedics and the police right to my very front door. I told her that when they arrived, I would gladly show them the undeniable proof that her medical proxy was entirely forged by her very own daughter-in-law. I watched her pale face drain of even more color as I boldly called her massive bluff. She knew using it would trigger a massive criminal investigation into her own fraudulent actions. Seeing that her medical threat was completely useless, Rochelle frantically changed her desperate strategy. She aggressively opened her very thick black briefcase and pulled out a different stack of papers. These documents looked incredibly old, printed on thick yellowing paper, and bound with a heavy blue legal cover. She proudly announced that her expensive corporate lawyers had suddenly discovered a brand new legal document, completely destroying me. She claimed the hidden document completely revoked my massive ownership shares in Soul Legacy and legally transferred total control of all family assets directly to her. Rochelle tapped the old paper aggressively and said, "Daddy always knew you were too weak and emotional to run a real business, Vivian. He secretly drafted this final addendum just weeks before he passed away. My legal team is filing it with the state courts this very afternoon to destroy you." "You are completely finished," she yelled. "You will not have a single dime to pay your very own utility bills, let alone ever fight." I slowly walked over to the very table and picked up the incredibly thick stack of old legal documents. They had clearly spent a massive amount of stolen money hiring a completely corrupt lawyer to perfectly forge this fake addendum. The legal jargon was incredibly convincing to ordinary untrained eyes. The signature at the very bottom of the final page looked remarkably similar to my father's harsh, messy handwriting. But as I stared closely at the final signature line, a massive, genuine smile slowly spread across my very face. I could not hold it in anymore. I laughed completely out loud. Rochelle stood there, completely confused and increasingly angry, watching me laugh at her very ultimate weapon. I tossed the fake legal document carelessly back onto the glass table and wiped a single tear of joy from my eye. I pointed a steady finger right at the forged signature on the final page of her fake document. I told her the signature looked incredibly good, but she made one massive, completely unforgivable mistake. I said Daddy absolutely hated the color blue Rochelle. He despised it so much he refused to wear blue clothes or buy blue cars in his entire life. He was incredibly superstitious and firmly believed that signing important legal documents in blue ink was terrible luck that would completely ruin a business deal. He exclusively used thick black ink for every single contract check and legal document he ever signed in his entire life. I watched the devastating realization slowly wash over Rochelle's face as she stared down at the bright blue ink. Her expensive, corrupt lawyers had used a standard blue pen to make the fake document look official. She snatched the forged document off the table, her hands shaking violently with absolute rage and total embarrassment. She sneered at me, her face twisted into a mask of pure total hatred. She told me it absolutely did not matter what color the ink was. She bragged loudly that her high-priced corporate lawyers were sharks who would completely crush me in court regardless of the tiny details. She turned around and angrily marched right toward my very front door, stomping her very expensive designer heels aggressively against my hardwood floors. She ripped the heavy door open and screamed over her shoulder that I was going to deeply regret ever crossing her. She slammed the door violently behind her. I walked slowly back through my massive house and went straight into my private home office. I carefully opened my sleek silver laptop. A few days ago, Marcus had quietly installed a highly sophisticated hidden camera directly inside Rochelle's executive office at the corporate headquarters. I quickly clicked on the secure encrypted application, and the live video feed immediately popped up on my bright computer screen. I watched intently as Rochelle aggressively stormed right through her office doors, throwing her heavy briefcase carelessly onto the floor. Chloe was already sitting there, waiting for her, pacing nervously back and forth, entirely terrified. I slowly turned up the volume on my computer speakers, listening carefully to their panicked, chaotic conversation. Rochelle suddenly stopped pacing and slammed her hands down hard onto her polished desk. She told Chloe they had absolutely no choice left but to initiate the final phase of their massive criminal plan immediately. Rochelle ordered Chloe to completely drain the massive emergency reserve accounts, stealing all our family money. She specifically instructed her to wire exactly $5 million directly from my personal, untouchable family trust fund straight into a highly secure, untraceable offshore bank account located in the Cayman Islands. I watched the hidden camera feed on my laptop screen as Rochelle gave her daughter-in-law the ultimate illegal command. Chloe was standing in the executive office, her hands shaking slightly as she logged into the highly secure corporate banking portal. She was preparing to wire $5 million from my untouchable personal family trust fund directly into a completely untraceable offshore account in the Cayman Islands. I sat back in my plush leather desk chair and let out a long, slow breath. This was the exact moment of truth. If I stopped the transaction right now, Rochelle and Chloe would only be guilty of attempted theft and corporate manipulation. They would hire expensive lawyers and tie me up in endless civil litigation for years. But if I let that money cross international lines using digital wire systems, it would immediately trigger mandatory federal investigations. It would instantly escalate their greedy actions into grand larceny, massive wire fraud, and high-level corporate espionage. All of those charges carried mandatory minimum sentences in federal prison. I reached across my large wooden desk and picked up my personal cell phone. I dialed the direct private number for my senior wealth manager at the downtown corporate bank. His name was David, and he had personally managed my vast financial portfolio for over 2 decades. He picked up on the very first ring, his voice sounding incredibly tense and worried. He told me that his fraud department had just flagged a massive, highly irregular international wire request originating from my corporate headquarters. He said the request was attempting to drain exactly $5 million from my restricted family trust. He pleaded with me to give him the verbal authorization to freeze the account immediately and contact the local authorities to report the massive theft. I closed my eyes for a brief second, picturing Rochelle's smug face when she handed me that forged medical proxy. I pictured Chloe's cruel smile when she served those ruined, unseasoned collard greens to her wealthy guests. I opened my eyes and looked completely straight ahead into the quiet emptiness of my home office. I spoke into the phone with a calm, totally unshakable voice. I told David not to block the transaction. I explicitly ordered him to approve the $5 million wire transfer and let the massive sum of money leave the country. David was completely stunned into silence. He begged me to reconsider, warning me that once the money hit the Cayman Islands, it would be nearly impossible to legally recover. I smiled a cold, tight smile and told him I knew exactly what I was doing. I told him to authorize the wire completely bypass the fraud alert and keep a highly detailed digital log of the exact internet protocol addresses used to initiate the massive transfer. I hung up the phone and watched the live camera feed as Chloe let out a massive sigh of relief, thinking her brilliant digital theft had gone completely unnoticed. They had just swallowed the poisonous bait, and the deadly federal trap was now firmly locked right around their ankles. Later that exact same afternoon, Chloe decided to completely flaunt her newly stolen corporate power. She drove her expensive luxury sports car directly to the very first Soul Legacy restaurant I ever opened. This was my flagship location, situated right in the heart of the historic downtown district. It was not just a regular restaurant, it was a sacred community landmark. The brick walls were completely filled with decades of beautiful family photographs, framed newspaper clippings, and the deeply ingrained smell of rich, savory spices. This building was the beating heart of my entire culinary empire, and it was run by the most fiercely loyal staff in the entire city. Chloe confidently marched through the heavy glass front doors, wearing a sharp designer business suit and carrying a sleek digital tablet. She completely ignored the long line of hungry, loyal customers waiting for their lunch and walked right into the busy kitchen area. She did not wear a sanitary hairnet or follow any proper health protocols. She just stood there in her expensive high heels, looking at my hardworking staff with absolute, total disgust. She immediately demanded that the general manager gather every single employee into the main dining room for an emergency mandatory staff meeting. Standing in the center of the restaurant, Chloe proudly announced that she was the brand new executive director of the entire Soul Legacy Corporation. She told the confused and worried staff that the company was undergoing a massive modern restructuring program. She aggressively stated that my traditional cooking methods and community-focused business models were completely outdated and financially inefficient. She looked directly at Miss Clara and Miss Hattie. These two beautiful elderly black women had been standing right by my side since the very beginning. They were the absolute master chefs who perfectly executed my famous secret recipes every single day for over 30 years. They were the respected grandmothers of the local neighborhood. Chloe pointed her manicured finger right at them and coldly announced that their positions were being completely eliminated, effective immediately. She told them they were too old, too slow, and too resistant to modern corporate changes. She completely humiliated them in front of the entire younger staff, stating they were being permanently replaced by cheap, inexperienced corporate culinary graduates who would blindly follow her new, unseasoned, standardized menu. Miss Clara began to cry, wiping her weathered face with her white kitchen apron. Miss Hattie stood completely still, her proud shoulders shaking with deep sadness and total disbelief. Chloe did not show a single ounce of empathy. She simply handed them standard termination papers and ordered them to clear out their personal lockers before the end of the hour. I pulled my car up to the flagship restaurant just as Chloe was speeding away in her loud luxury vehicle. I walked through the front doors and saw the absolute devastation she had left behind. The bustling, joyful restaurant was completely silent. The younger staff members were standing around looking totally lost and incredibly angry. Miss Clara and Miss Hattie were sitting quietly at a small corner table, holding their small cardboard boxes filled with personal items and crying softly. I did not yell or throw a massive public tantrum like Chloe desperately wanted me to do. I did not rush into the kitchen to try and violently reverse her cruel executive orders. I walked slowly across the dining room floor, my head held completely high. I pulled up a chair and sat right down next to my two oldest, dearest friends. I reached into my large leather handbag and pulled out two incredibly thick, heavy envelopes. I placed them gently onto the table right in front of the tearful women. I looked deeply into their sad eyes and gave them a warm, highly confident smile. I told them to open the heavy envelopes. Inside were massive certified bank checks representing huge severance packages that were literally triple their annual salaries. They looked at the massive sums of money in total shock, completely unable to speak. I leaned in very close so the new cheap corporate managers could not hear me. I softly whispered to them to please take a nice long 2-week vacation because they were going to be back very soon and they would absolutely be returning as senior executive management. While I was quietly securing the absolute loyalty of my staff, Marcus was completely isolating himself inside his private medical laboratory at the hospital. He had spent the entire night agonizing over the devastating conversation we had at the old family brownstone. He needed absolute, undeniable scientific proof before he completely destroyed his own mother and his wife. During our emotional meeting, I had allowed him to carefully pull a single long strand of hair from my head right from the root. He had taken that tiny genetic sample back to his highly advanced sterile laboratory to run a comprehensive, unauthorized maternal DNA sequence, matching it directly against his own genetic markers. Marcus stood completely alone in the cold, bright room, watching the massive, complex sequencing machines hum and quietly process the data. His brilliant medical mind was racing with a million different conflicting emotions. He vividly remembered growing up in a massive cold house where Rochelle barely ever hugged him or showed him any genuine maternal affection. He remembered her constantly pushing him to succeed purely for social status and financial gain, never once asking him if he was actually happy. He contrasted those cold, sterile memories with the incredible warmth and deep, unconditional love I had always shown him whenever he visited my home or my busy restaurants. The stark emotional differences suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. The expensive laboratory printer suddenly beeped loudly, completely breaking the heavy silence in the room. A crisp white piece of paper slowly slid out of the machine. Marcus walked over his hands, shaking violently as he picked up the highly confidential official results. He stared down at the black ink, reading the complex genetic data lines. His eyes immediately darted to the very bottom of the page to the final conclusive summary line. The scientific results confirmed an absolute, undeniable 99.9% genetic probability of a direct maternal match. The heavy paper slipped from his trembling fingers and fluttered softly to the cold linoleum floor. The massive, crushing weight of a 40-year-old demonic lie completely broke him in that exact moment. He collapsed into a plastic rolling chair, burying his handsome face deep into his hands. He wept loudly and uncontrollably, mourning the beautiful, stolen childhood we never got to share together. He cried for the young, terrified 22-year-old girl who was brutally drugged and lied to in that shady, dark clinic. He cried for the massive, violent betrayal committed by the very woman who had falsely called herself his mother his entire life. But Marcus was a brilliant, highly disciplined surgeon. He was heavily trained to remain completely calm and totally focused in the absolute face of massive trauma. He allowed himself exactly 10 minutes to completely break down and mourn his stolen life. Then he slowly wiped the salty tears from his face and stood up straight. His deep brown eyes were no longer filled with sadness or confusion. They were completely cold hard and incredibly calculating. He picked up the official genetic proof from the floor, folded it carefully, and locked it securely inside his private, heavy metal safe. He washed his face, straightened his expensive silk tie, and completely channeled his massive, violent rage into a perfect strategy for total corporate destruction. The very next morning, Rochelle and Chloe aggressively called for an emergency mandatory meeting of the Soul Legacy Board of Directors. They rented out the massive, sleek glass boardroom located on the absolute top floor of the tallest corporate skyscraper in downtown Atlanta. The massive room featured a huge polished mahogany table and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire sprawling city. The remaining 12 members of the executive board were already sitting nervously in their expensive leather chairs, murmuring quietly about the sudden chaos completely engulfing the massive company. Rochelle sat proudly at the absolute head of the long table, wearing a ridiculously expensive tailored suit and a massive smug smile. Chloe sat right next to her, completely playing the role of the highly concerned, dedicated family member. Marcus walked confidently into the massive glass room, wearing a sharp, dark charcoal suit, looking every inch the completely compliant, supportive son they desperately needed him to be. They absolutely needed Marcus to cast his massive deciding proxy vote to legally finalize my permanent removal from the entire company. Rochelle stood up and aggressively addressed the quiet, nervous board members. She put on a brilliant theatrical performance, completely faking deep sadness and heavy reluctance. She told the wealthy executives that watching my tragic mental decline had completely broken her loving heart. She blatantly lied, claiming I was becoming highly aggressive, totally delusional, and completely incapable of making rational financial decisions for the massive brand. Chloe then dramatically slid the highly illegal forged medical evaluation right across the polished table, letting the board members read the fake dementia diagnosis. The oldest board member, a conservative, wealthy man, looked directly at Marcus. He asked Marcus for his highly respected professional and familial opinion on this deeply tragic situation. Marcus did not flinch or show a single ounce of hesitation. He looked directly at his mother and his wife, perfectly masking his absolute raging hatred. He spoke with a calm, measured, completely professional voice. He told the entire board that it was the absolute hardest decision of his life, but he fully agreed with the medical assessment. He stated that for the long-term health of the massive company and for my own personal safety, I needed to be permanently, completely removed from all corporate operations. Rochelle let out a loud, dramatic sigh of fake relief, while Chloe completely failed to hide the massive, greedy smile spreading across her pale face. The board chairman formally called for the final, highly official vote to completely execute the hostile takeover. Marcus raised his right hand high into the air and boldly voted yes to permanently oust me from my own massive empire. The rest of the completely deceived board members quickly followed suit, making the massive theft completely legally binding. Rochelle and Chloe immediately began celebrating their massive total victory, signing the final heavy stack of binding federal corporate transfer documents right there on the table. Marcus politely excused himself from the loud, joyful celebration, claiming he needed to get back to his patients at the hospital. He walked calmly out of the massive glass boardroom and stepped onto the completely empty, quiet elevator. As the heavy metal doors slid completely shut, he pulled his personal cell phone out of his dark suit pocket. He opened our private encrypted chat and typed a short, highly specific message. He hit send and watched the message officially deliver to my phone. The trap is set. They just signed the federal documents. The elevator rapidly descended the massive glass skyscraper, but Marcus felt lighter than he had in his entire life. He knew that every single signature his mother and his wife had just arrogantly placed on those binding corporate documents was another heavy nail in their rapidly closing federal coffin. He walked out into the bright, warm Atlanta sunlight, feeling the absolute thrill of impending justice. Meanwhile, I was sitting quietly in my home office, staring down at the glowing screen of my phone. I read his message over and over again, letting the massive reality of our incredible victory slowly wash over me. The $5 million had already successfully cleared the international banking security protocols and landed safely inside the untraceable offshore accounts. The Internal Revenue Service was already quietly building a massive, impenetrable case against Chloe's brand-new fake shell company. And now my own greedy sister had just proudly submitted highly illegal forged medical documents to a formal board of directors to steal a multi-million-dollar corporate entity. They genuinely thought they had completely won the massive war, but they were completely oblivious to the fact that they were already dead women walking. I stood up from my plush desk chair and walked slowly over to my large bay window, looking out over the beautiful, sprawling gardens I had cultivated for decades. I thought about the painful, agonizing tears I had cried 40 years ago in that cold, dark, terrifying clinic. I thought about the endless, grueling hours I had spent standing over hot, boiling pots of heavily seasoned stew, just trying to build a safe, secure life for a sister who secretly hated my absolute guts. The massive, crushing weight of all those terrible years was finally beginning to lift right off my tired shoulders. I knew the absolute hardest part of the battle was still rapidly approaching. We had gathered all the massive, highly illegal evidence we needed to completely destroy them, but we still had to properly execute the final massive public execution. Rochelle loved nothing more than a huge, flashy public audience. She thrived on the bright camera flashes and the loud, fake adoration of her wealthy country club friends. So I decided right then and there that I would completely grant her absolute deepest wish. I would give her the most massive, unforgettable public stage she had ever seen in her entire pathetic life. And I would use that exact same stage to totally burn her entire fake world, right down to the actual ground. The next few days were going to be absolutely critical. I needed to quietly contact my highly ruthless legal connections and fully prepare the massive, devastating trap we had just successfully built. Chloe would undoubtedly spend the entire week walking around my massive restaurants, firing more innocent, hardworking people, and completely ruining my beautiful recipes. Rochelle would absolutely spend her stolen money buying ridiculously expensive new dresses and bragging loudly to anyone who would listen about her brilliant new corporate takeover. But I would just sit back and patiently watch them completely destroy their own lives. Because true power does not need to scream or cry or throw massive, desperate tantrums in a crowded hospital hallway. True, real power sits completely quietly in the dark, patiently letting the greedy, arrogant rats wander blindly right into the massive, heavy steel trap. And when the perfect moment finally arrives, true power simply reaches out and completely snaps the heavy trap firmly shut forever. Marcus drove his luxury car slowly through the busy streets of downtown Atlanta, entirely consumed by his massive, swirling thoughts. He thought about his beautiful young daughter waiting for him back at his massive, cold mansion. He knew that sending his wife to a federal prison would completely shatter his little girl's world, but he also knew he could not raise a child in a home built entirely on massive, demonic lies and corporate theft. Chloe had completely shown her true racist, greedy colors when she fired those sweet, elderly black women without a single ounce of empathy. She was a deeply toxic, arrogant woman who viewed the hard-working people of my community as completely disposable garbage. Marcus made a quiet, solemn vow right there in his car to protect his daughter from that terrible, poisonous influence forever. He would raise her with the deep, beautiful traditions of our true family, and he would make sure she knew the incredible, strong woman who was her actual biological grandmother. Back at the flagship restaurant, Miss Clara and Miss Hattie were still completely trying to process the massive financial gift I had just freely handed them. Miss Clara slowly reached out with a trembling, weathered hand and carefully touched the thick, heavy envelope. She looked up at me with tears completely streaming down her beautiful, dark face, asking me if this was really actually happening. I gently placed my hand directly over hers, feeling the rough, familiar calluses we both shared from decades of hard, honest work in hot, demanding kitchens. I softly told her that every single penny in that envelope was absolutely real and completely well-deserved. I explained that the evil, greedy women who had just kicked them out were currently walking entirely blindfolded into a massive, inescapable legal nightmare. I told them to take their families on a beautiful, long vacation to rest their tired feet and to stay completely by the phone. When they inevitably returned, they would not be standing over hot, greasy fryers anymore. They would be the highly respected executive training directors for the entire national franchise, teaching the next bright generation how to properly respect the deep history and the rich culture of true Southern soul food. I walked back out to my car, leaving them crying tears of absolute joy instead of deep, painful sorrow. I drove back to my sprawling, quiet estate and immediately began gathering the massive arsenal of highly destructive evidence we had so carefully collected. I placed the detailed bank logs showing the massive $5 million international wire fraud right next to the Internal Revenue Service audit notifications. I added the highly illegal, forged medical diagnostic proxy that Rochelle had so arrogantly used to steal my massive company. And finally, I left a completely blank, empty space right in the center of my heavy oak desk for the most completely devastating weapon of them all, the undeniable official genetic maternal matching laboratory results that Marcus was currently keeping completely secure in his heavy metal safe. We had patiently gathered the most massive, indestructible arsenal of federal criminal evidence in the entire history of the city. The terrible long war that Rochelle had secretly started 40 years ago in that cold, dark clinic was finally coming to an incredibly violent, absolutely spectacular end. And I was going to make absolutely certain that she never ever saw it coming. The days following the hostile boardroom takeover were filled with an obnoxious display of stolen wealth and massive arrogance. Rochelle was completely drunk on her brand new corporate power, and she desperately wanted the entire world to know it. She immediately began planning a massive, ostentatious event she officially dubbed the Soul Legacy Rebranding Gala. This was not just a simple corporate dinner party to celebrate a new business direction. This was a highly calculated public execution of my entire legacy. Rochelle sent out hundreds of expensive gold foil invitations to the most elite wealthy socialites, politicians, and media outlets in the entire city of Atlanta. She hired a massive, aggressive public relations firm to heavily promote the gala, pitching it as the dawn of a fresh modern era for the company. She gave highly publicized interviews to local magazines, blatantly lying about how she was boldly stepping in to rescue the failing brand from my outdated ghetto business models. She intended to use this massive, shiny public stage to permanently erase my name from the very company I had built from absolute scratch with my own two bare hands. While Rochelle was busy feeding her massive, greedy ego to the local press, Chloe was completely draining the corporate accounts to fund the extravagant event. Chloe viewed the stolen company treasury as her own personal, limitless credit card, and she spent the money with absolutely zero hesitation. She hired an incredibly expensive luxury event planner and rented out the grand ballroom of the most exclusive five-star hotel in the downtown financial district. She completely ignored the tight, sensible corporate budgets I had maintained for decades and began throwing massive amounts of money at the most ridiculous, unnecessary decorations imaginable. She ordered massive custom ice sculptures shaped like the new corporate logo to be placed at every single entrance. She demanded thousands of rare exotic flowers be flown in on a private jet just to decorate the cocktail tables. But her absolute worst offense was her own personal wardrobe. Chloe actually authorized a massive corporate wire transfer of exactly $500,000 to completely cover her gala expenses. She used the stolen money to purchase a custom-made, heavily jeweled designer gown directly from a high-end boutique in Paris. She bought a massive new diamond necklace and hired a team of celebrity makeup artists to make her look absolutely flawless for the cameras. I sat quietly in my home office and watched all of these massive illegal expenses pop up on the secure duplicate financial tracking software Marcus had secretly installed on my computer. I watched Chloe literally spend $500,000 of stolen federal community development grant money on ice sculptures and shiny rocks. She was totally oblivious to the massive, terrifying reality that every single dollar she spent was adding another full year to her impending federal prison sentence. They were throwing a massive, expensive party on the deck of a rapidly sinking ship, and they were completely blinded by their own extreme greed. I did not feel a single ounce of anger or sadness as I watched them completely drain the corporate accounts. I just felt a deep, cold sense of absolute calm. They had perfectly set the massive public stage just like I knew they would. Now it was my turn to completely ensure that the grand finale of their little show was entirely unforgettable. Early the next morning, I dressed in a sharp-tailored dark navy suit and drove my car downtown. I did not go anywhere near the corporate headquarters or the busy flagship restaurant. I drove directly to the massive, imposing federal courthouse building located right in the center of the city. I walked through the heavy metal security detectors and took the private elevator straight up to the top floor. I was scheduled for a highly confidential private meeting with a senior federal prosecutor named Alexander Vance. Alexander was a completely ruthless, highly feared government attorney who specialized exclusively in massive corporate fraud and high-level financial crimes. He had a brutal reputation for completely destroying corrupt executives and locking them away in maximum security federal prisons for decades. He was the exact weapon I absolutely needed to completely obliterate my sister and her spoiled daughter-in-law. I walked into his massive corner office and sat down in the heavy leather chair across from his wide polished desk. Alexander did not offer me coffee or engage in any polite small talk. He just looked at me with sharp, cold eyes and told me to show him exactly what I had. I reached into my heavy leather briefcase and began pulling out the massive arsenal of undeniable criminal evidence we had patiently collected over the past week. I placed the thick stack of documents directly onto his clean desk, spreading them out so he could see the massive scale of their illegal operation. I handed him the highly detailed digital Internet protocol logs that Marcus had carefully extracted from the corporate servers. These massive logs undeniably proved that Chloe was the exact person who logged into the banking portal and initiated the massive illegal transfer. Then I handed him the official bank routing numbers, tracing the massive $5 million theft directly from my restricted trust fund all the way to the completely untraceable offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Alexander picked up the complex financial documents, and his cold eyes immediately widened in absolute genuine surprise. He was an incredibly seasoned federal prosecutor, but even he was completely shocked by the massive, blatant audacity of their financial crimes. He told me that moving restricted federal community grant money across international lines was a massive Level 1 federal offense. But I was not completely finished handing over my heavy weapons. I reached back into my briefcase and pulled out the absolute final nail in their closing coffin. I handed him the highly illegal forged medical proxy that Rochelle had used to officially steal my company in front of the entire board of directors. I explained exactly how Chloe had illegally forged her husband's signature and used his professional medical credentials to execute a massive hostile corporate takeover. Alexander sat back in his heavy leather chair and stared at the massive pile of undeniable criminal evidence sitting directly on his desk. He slowly took off his glasses and looked at me with a deep sense of absolute professional respect. He told me that he had been prosecuting massive corporate crimes for over 20 years, and he had never seen a case this incredibly perfect. He said they had left a massive digital paper trail a mile wide and completely incriminated themselves on multiple different severe federal levels. He explained that with this exact evidence, he could easily secure massive grand jury indictments for major wire fraud, international money laundering, identity theft, and high-level corporate espionage. He said the mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines for these specific massive crimes would ensure that both women spent at least the next 2 decades sitting in a federal prison cell. We spent the next 3 hours carefully reviewing every single page of the massive criminal evidence. I walked him through the entire timeline of their massive hostile takeover, completely explaining exactly how they had systematically locked me out of my own life work. Alexander took detailed, meticulous notes, completely building an ironclad federal case right there in his office. He told me he would immediately dispatch a massive team of Federal Bureau of Investigation agents to officially secure the offshore accounts and completely freeze every single asset associated with Chloe's fake shell company. He completely assured me that the massive federal trap was now firmly locked and loaded. All he needed to do was officially execute the massive arrest warrants. As our long, intense meeting finally came to an end, I stood up from the heavy leather chair and picked up my empty briefcase. Alexander stood up and walked me toward the heavy oak door of his massive office. He stopped right before turning the brass handle and looked deeply into my eyes. He had seen massive families completely destroyed by greed and betrayal countless times in his long career. But he knew this specific situation was incredibly personal and deeply painful. He knew that the 2 women he was about to completely destroy were my own flesh and blood. He looked at me with a rare flicker of genuine human empathy. He paused, taking a long, deep breath before speaking. He wanted to make absolutely certain that I was completely ready for the massive public fallout that would inevitably follow these severe federal charges. He asked me a very direct, highly important question right then and there. The prosecutor asks, "This will destroy your sister and your daughter-in-law, Mrs. Vivian." "Are you sure?" Vivian replies. "They destroyed my life 40 years ago. I want the FBI waiting at the dessert course." The downtown financial district was completely transformed that evening into a massive, glittering spectacle of stolen corporate wealth. The exclusive five-star hotel was bathed in bright, flashing lights as a massive red carpet was rolled out right across the wide city sidewalk. Expensive luxury cars pulled up one by one, dropping off the absolute most wealthy and influential socialites, politicians, and media executives in the entire city of Atlanta. The air was incredibly thick with the heavy scent of expensive designer perfumes and the loud, chaotic popping of camera flashes echoing constantly throughout the cool night air. Rochelle had successfully gathered the absolute highest echelon of high society to witness her massive corporate triumph. She had hired dozens of aggressive private security guards wearing dark black suits to stand at every single entrance, making sure the event remained highly exclusive and completely untouchable. Right in the center of the massive red carpet, Chloe was standing underneath a huge, shiny corporate banner, holding a tall glass of expensive champagne. She was wearing the ridiculous custom-made jeweled designer gown she had bought using $500,000 of my stolen federal community development grant money entirely. She looked completely radiant, entirely drunk on the massive amount of stolen power she currently held. A large group of local television reporters and eager journalists had completely surrounded her, shoving large, fuzzy microphones right toward her smiling face. I sat quietly in the back of my hired luxury town car, parked just across the busy street, watching her terrible, arrogant performance through the dark-tinted windows. I rolled down the thick glass window just an inch so I could perfectly hear her loud, boastful voice carrying across the cool evening air toward my quiet vehicle. Chloe was actively speaking to a prominent local news anchor, painting herself as a brilliant corporate savior. She looked directly into the bright television cameras and boldly claimed that the company had been rapidly dying under my absolute terrible leadership. She told the eager reporters that my traditional cooking methods and community-focused business models were completely outdated and deeply embarrassing. She actually used the word ghetto right on live television to describe the beautiful, rich culture and the massive, lifelong dedication I had poured into my business for the past 40 incredible years of my life. She smiled a cruel, arrogant smile and told the entire city that she had personally stepped in to rescue the massive corporate brand from a highly unstable old woman who completely lacked sophisticated business vision. Listening to her incredibly racist, entitled lies did not make me angry or sad at all. It simply confirmed exactly why I was about to completely destroy her entire fake world. I rolled the dark window back up and looked down at my own reflection in the small mirror. I was not wearing a dowdy conservative business suit or a simple plain dress. I had spent the entire week working completely secretly with a brilliant local black fashion designer to create an absolute masterpiece. I was wearing a custom-tailored regal emerald green gown made of the finest heavy silk. The rich, deep color perfectly complemented my dark skin, making me look like an absolute powerful queen preparing for a massive, victorious battle. But the most devastating part of my entire outfit was the massive, heavy jewelry resting beautifully against my collarbone. I was dripping in thick, stunning layers of flawless, real diamonds that sparkled brilliantly in the dim light. These were not just any random expensive diamonds, but the exact same breathtaking heirloom diamonds that belonged to my late mother. Decades ago, Rochelle had aggressively searched our entire family home looking for these exact jewels, intending to pawn them to fund her wild, reckless lifestyle. When she could not find them, she completely assumed I had stolen them and secretly sold them behind her back. She never knew that our father had specifically entrusted them directly to me because he knew I was the only daughter responsible enough to keep them completely safe and totally secure. Wearing them tonight was a highly calculated, silent psychological attack, completely designed to shatter her massive, arrogant ego the absolute second she saw me. I signaled my quiet professional driver to pull the long, dark car directly up to the absolute front of the massive red carpet. The heavy luxury vehicle rolled smoothly right past the long line of waiting guests and stopped exactly in front of the main entrance. The massive, aggressive security guards immediately stepped forward to inspect the vehicle, assuming a highly important local politician or wealthy celebrity was suddenly arriving at the event. My driver quickly stepped out and opened the heavy back door for me. I placed my expensive, sparkling silver heel directly onto the plush red carpet and slowly stepped completely out of the vehicle. The absolute very second I stood up straight, the entire chaotic energy of the massive red carpet shifted completely. The loud popping of camera flashes stopped entirely. The eager journalists completely lowered their heavy cameras, and the wealthy elite guests turned their heads in absolute total shock. I stood there looking incredibly powerful, incredibly rich, and completely unbothered by the massive corporate theft. I slowly began walking directly down the center of the massive red carpet, my heavy emerald gown flowing beautifully behind me. The thick heirloom diamonds sparkled blindingly under the bright, harsh event lights, commanding absolute total respect from every single person standing in the immediate vicinity. The loud, confident voice of my daughter-in-law completely stopped mid-sentence. Chloe stared at me with her mouth hanging wide open, completely paralyzed by my stunning, unexpected arrival. She immediately dropped her expensive champagne glass onto the thick red carpet, spilling the bubbly liquid absolutely everywhere around her expensive shoes. The reporters quickly turned around, following her terrified gaze, and immediately recognized me as the true original founder of the massive culinary empire. They completely abandoned Chloe and rushed directly toward me, shouting loud, eager questions about my sudden, aggressive removal from the corporate board of directors. I did not answer a single one of their loud, chaotic questions. I simply gave them a warm, highly confident smile and continued walking gracefully right past them, heading directly toward the massive, heavy glass doors of the Grand Hotel Ballroom where the massive party was taking place inside. I could see the massive, beautiful ice sculptures melting slightly in the warm evening air, and the ridiculous, expensive, exotic flowers completely covering the grand entryway. It was an absolute sickening display of stolen federal money, but I knew it would serve as the perfect, beautiful background for the massive, destructive trap I was about to completely spring. Before I could even reach the massive glass doors, I heard the loud, angry clicking of heavy designer heels stomping aggressively across the marble floor inside the massive hotel lobby, heading directly toward the front entrance doors outside. Rochelle came completely storming out of the grand ballroom, her face twisted into a massive, ugly mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She was wearing a ridiculously tight, shiny gold dress that made her look completely desperate for attention. She was flanked on both sides by 4 massive, muscular private security guards wearing tight black suits and highly aggressive expressions. She completely stopped right in the middle of the grand hotel entryway, physically blocking my path into the massive ballroom. She took one long, terrifying look at the stunning custom emerald gown I was currently wearing with pride. Her angry eyes immediately darted straight down to my neck. The absolute second she recognized our late mother's priceless heirloom diamonds resting beautifully against my skin, all the remaining color completely drained right out of her face. Her hands began shaking violently with absolute rage and total, bitter jealousy. She had spent decades completely convincing herself that she was the absolute supreme queen of our family, and seeing me wearing those hidden diamonds completely destroyed that massive, arrogant illusion. Rochelle took a massive step forward, pointing a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face in total, absolute fury. She completely lost her fake, sophisticated composure right in front of the wealthy elite guests and the eager television reporters. She yelled loudly that I had absolutely no right to be there, claiming that the event was completely, highly exclusive and strictly invitation only. I just stood there completely calm, my hands resting gently clasped in front of my beautiful emerald gown. I did not yell back or cause a massive public physical scene. I simply stared right into her angry, desperate eyes, making her feel completely small and entirely powerless in front of the massive crowd. She aggressively turned to the 4 massive security guards standing tightly around her. She ordered them to completely remove me from the premises immediately. She loudly hissed at me, her voice dripping with absolute pure venom. She told me that she completely owned absolutely everything now. She bragged that my massive culinary empire, my rich corporate legacy, and my entire life work legally belonged entirely to her. She looked at the security guards and told them to throw this crazy old woman out right into the dirty city street, where she thought I completely truly belonged forever. The 4 massive security guards immediately stepped forward, reaching their large, heavy hands out to physically grab my arms and forcefully drag me away from the massive grand entrance. The wealthy elite guests gasped loudly, stepping back to completely avoid the massive impending physical altercation. The television reporters quickly raised their heavy cameras, eagerly anticipating a massive, embarrassing public meltdown. But they were completely wrong about my intentions. I did not panic, and I absolutely did not try to physically fight the massive security guards. I simply reached one calm, steady hand directly into my small purse. I pulled out a small, sleek black electronic microphone that Marcus had secretly provided for me earlier that afternoon. It was a highly advanced, expensive piece of audio equipment that was already perfectly synced directly to the main sound system located inside the massive grand ballroom. I calmly tapped the top of the sleek black microphone twice with my fingernail, feeling the satisfying heavy thud echo perfectly connecting directly to the massive frequency inside. The loud sound completely silenced the classical music playing in the background, making everyone stop and look directly at me in absolute total confusion. The heavy thump of my finger tapping the sleek black microphone echoed like a massive thunderclap throughout the entire grand ballroom and across the busy street outside. The expensive classical music that was playing softly through the massive hotel speaker system completely cut out in an instant. Total absolute silence fell over the massive crowd of wealthy elite guests, aggressive television reporters, and panicked private security guards. Every single pair of eyes locked directly onto me as I stood proudly on the beautiful red carpet, wearing my stunning custom emerald gown and my late mother's sparkling heirloom diamonds. I lifted the small microphone directly to my mouth. I did not yell or scream or let a single ounce of chaotic emotion leak into my voice. My tone was completely lethal, totally steady, and incredibly calm. I spoke clearly into the microphone, and my voice boomed massively over the high-tech surround sound system, vibrating right through the heavy glass doors and bouncing off the tall downtown skyscrapers. "Welcome, everyone," I said, my voice sounding like a powerful judge, delivering a massive final sentence. "Welcome to the absolute public funeral of Rochelle's fake stolen dignity." The massive crowd outside and inside the Grand Hotel gasped completely in unison. The television cameras immediately started rolling again, their bright red recording lights blinking frantically in the cool night air. Rochelle stood completely frozen right in the middle of the hotel entrance, her jaw dropping open in absolute total horror. She tried to signal her aggressive private security guards to snatch the microphone right out of my hand, but they were completely paralyzed by the massive authoritative energy radiating directly from my presence. I pressed a tiny hidden button located directly on the side of the sleek black device. Marcus had perfectly synchronized this exact frequency, not just to the audio speakers, but directly to the massive visual display systems located inside the grand ballroom. Instantly, the beautiful rotating corporate logos completely vanished from the massive LED screens mounted all around the expensive hotel walls. They were completely replaced by a massive high-definition image of a very old, heavily yellowed government document. It was the forged 1986 birth certificate that Rochelle had used to officially steal my only living son. The massive screens clearly displayed the completely fraudulent signatures and the sketchy details of the dark, illegal downtown clinic. The wealthy elite guests inside the ballroom completely abandoned their expensive cocktails and crowded closely around the massive LED screens, squinting to read the highly illegal medical document. I stood right there on the red carpet and began publicly revealing the painful truth to the entire city of Atlanta. I told the large, completely silent crowd the real meaning behind that old document. I explained clearly that 40 years ago, my greedy and jealous sister had orchestrated a cunning plan. I told them how she took a terrified young pregnant girl to an illegal facility, paying the staff to make me lose my senses at the most vulnerable moment of my life. I also shared how Rochelle pretended to be pregnant, using heavy pillows and luxury vacations, while I was working hard to support the family. I explained how she callously stole my beautiful newborn baby boy right out of the delivery room, completely convinced me that my child had tragically died, and successfully claimed him as her own flesh and blood, purely to steal a massive $2 million trust fund from our late traditional father. The absolute shocking magnitude of the massive 40-year-old crime sent a massive, violent shockwave right through the entire crowd. The wealthy socialites, who had been loudly praising Rochelle just 10 minutes ago, were now completely staring at her with absolute total disgust. The aggressive television reporters shoved their heavy, fuzzy microphones right into Rochelle's terrified face, demanding immediate answers about the massive kidnapping allegations. Chloe was still standing outside on the red carpet, her expensive jeweled gown completely forgotten as she stared up at the massive LED screens displaying the forged birth certificate. She had absolutely no idea about the dark, twisted kidnapping her mother-in-law had committed 4 decades ago, and the massive, terrifying realization completely shattered her arrogant corporate savior persona. Rochelle completely panicked, realizing her entire shiny fake world was aggressively burning right down to the ground in front of the entire city. She frantically lunged directly toward one of the local news anchors, violently snatching his large microphone right out of his hands. She held the stolen microphone tightly to her mouth, her hands shaking violently, and her eyes completely wide with absolute total desperation. She let out a loud, incredibly awkward, nervous laugh that echoed terribly over the massive hotel sound system, completely clashing with my lethal, calm tone. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at me and desperately tried to spin her absolute favorite vicious narrative. "Please do not listen to a single crazy word she is saying." Rochelle laughed nervously, her voice cracking terribly under the massive public pressure. "My poor sister is completely losing her mind right now. She is actively having a severe dementia episode right in front of all of you. She has been completely medically diagnosed with severe cognitive decline and extreme aggressive delusions. She is just wildly making up these horrible, tragic stories because the corporate board of directors legally removed her from the massive company we built together. Please, someone call an ambulance immediately to get her the serious psychiatric help she desperately needs." She frantically looked completely around the massive, chaotic crowd, desperately searching for absolutely anyone who would support her massive web of twisted lies. She spotted Marcus standing completely quietly near the grand entrance doors, wearing his sharp, dark charcoal suit. She aggressively pointed the stolen microphone directly toward her brilliant, successful surgeon's son, desperately hoping his respected medical credentials would completely save her massive sinking ship. "Marcus, please come up here right now." Rochelle begged loudly over the massive speakers, her voice dripping with absolute total manipulation. "You are a highly respected, brilliant medical professional. Please tell all these wonderful people the absolute truth about your poor aunt's severe mental condition. Please completely reassure them that these wild kidnapping accusations are just the tragic, aggressive ramblings of a deeply sick, delusional old woman." The entire massive crowd completely turned their heads directly toward Marcus, entirely anticipating his expert medical assessment. The bright television camera lights violently swung right over to him, capturing his every single movement on live local television. Rochelle smiled a fake, desperate smile, completely believing she still absolutely controlled him. She genuinely thought he was the perfect, obedient golden son who would blindly protect the family image at absolutely all costs. But Marcus did not smile back at her. He completely ignored her desperate, manipulative pleas and slowly began walking directly toward the massive podium set up near the Grand Hotel entrance. Every single loud footstep he took echoed heavily against the polished marble floor, completely silencing the aggressive reporters and the shocked, wealthy guests. He reached the massive wooden podium and calmly adjusted the tall, shiny microphone directly in front of him. He looked out at the massive sea of wealthy elite socialites, eager television journalists, and terrified private security guards. Then he slowly turned his head and looked directly at Rochelle. The look on his handsome face was completely devoid of any familial love or obedient respect. It was a look of pure, absolute, total disgust, completely unmasked, for the entire city to witness. The bright camera flashes reflected directly in his deep brown eyes as he completely prepared to drop the absolute final devastating hammer right onto his mother's fake stolen life. He leaned completely close to the tall silver microphone, his voice completely steady and entirely resonant, echoing powerfully through the dark, cool night air, completely drowning out Rochelle's desperate, nervous breathing. The massive crowd completely held its collective breath, waiting patiently for the brilliant young surgeon to finally speak his mind to the world. Rochelle stood there completely frozen like a frightened animal, while her fake, desperate smile slowly began melting right off her pale, sweating face. She could completely see the massive, unstoppable truth shining brightly in his dark eyes, but she was entirely powerless to stop it. Marcus did not completely yell or show any massive, explosive anger to the waiting crowd. His soft delivery was completely cold, entirely clinical, and absolutely devastating. He looked completely past the bright flashing cameras and stared directly into the very soul of the deeply evil woman who had violently stolen him 40 years ago. He took one final deep breath, completely severing his fake, toxic ties to her forever, before bravely speaking his own absolute, undeniable truth. "I am a medical professional, and as a professional, I know a maternal DNA match when I see one." The absolute silence in the grand ballroom was completely deafening. Marcus stood tall at the heavy wooden podium, gripping the edges with his strong surgeon hands. He did not look like the obedient golden child anymore. He looked like a man who had completely shattered his own heavy chains. The bright television cameras focused entirely on his face, broadcasting his incredible bravery to the entire city. He pressed a small button on the sleek podium, connecting his personal tablet directly to the massive screens. The old yellowed forged birth certificate completely vanished from the bright LED displays above us immediately. In its place, a brand new, highly official medical document completely filled the massive screens. It was the highly confidential official genetic laboratory report he had secretly run just a few days ago. The bold black letters at the very top clearly stated it was a comprehensive maternal sequence matching test. Marcus pointed directly at the massive screen, his voice echoing loudly through the silent room. He told the shocked crowd to look very closely at the final numbers located at the absolute bottom of the page. The undeniable scientific result proudly displayed a 99.9% match. Rochelle let out a loud, terrified gasp, taking a massive backward step on the red carpet. She looked exactly like a completely trapped animal, desperately searching for a tiny escape route that simply did not exist. Marcus did not stop there. He clicked another button, and two massive high-definition photographs appeared right next to the undeniable genetic results. The photograph on the left clearly showed the rare star-shaped hyperpigmentation located perfectly on my right hip. The photograph on the right proudly displayed the exact same unique genetic birthmark, located perfectly upon his very own lower dark back completely. The massive crowd erupted into loud, chaotic whispers, entirely unable to process the absolute massive scale of this dark, twisted family secret. Marcus leaned directly into the silver microphone, demanding absolute total silence from the wealthy elite guests. He told them that for his entire life, his mother had completely lied to him about his true medical history. She had completely convinced him that his unique, beautiful birthmark was just an ugly genetic flaw. But the absolute truth was that the unique mark was undeniable physical proof of his true biological connection to the very woman she entirely hated always. He turned his dark eyes directly toward Rochelle, who was currently shaking violently in her tight, shiny gold dress. He told the entire city exactly what she had violently done in the summer of 1986. He explained in cold clinical detail how she had completely faked a high-risk pregnancy to secure a massive $2 million inheritance from our late father. He told the horrified reporters how she had aggressively stalked her own pregnant sister, completely waiting for the perfect vulnerable moment to strike like a deeply venomous snake hiding secretly in the tall green grass. Totally. He detailed exactly how she had completely manipulated a young, terrified pregnant girl into checking into a dark, illegal downtown medical clinic. He told the massive crowd that Rochelle had aggressively bribed the corrupt attending nurse with massive amounts of stolen cash. She paid them to completely heavily drug my intravenous line, making me lose consciousness during the most important, beautiful moment of my entire life. She aggressively paid the corrupt medical staff to completely falsify the official hospital records and falsely declare that my beautiful, healthy newborn baby boy had tragically died of severe respiratory failure immediately after birth. The wealthy elite socialites who had just been drinking her expensive champagne were now completely physically backing away from her in absolute total disgust. Several people in the massive crowd actually covered their mouths in genuine horror, completely sickened by the massive evil she had casually committed. Marcus completely ignored the chaotic reactions and kept speaking his powerful voice, completely dominating the cool night air. He told everyone how she had callously walked out of that dark clinic holding my stolen baby and completely claimed him as her own flesh and blood to secure a massive, heavy financial payout entirely. He told the massive television audience that she had completely raised him in a cold, massive house, completely devoid of any real maternal love or genuine affection. She only viewed him as a massive, shiny financial trophy to aggressively parade around her wealthy fake country club friends. She pushed him into a highly stressful medical career, not because she wanted him to be happy, but because she desperately wanted the absolute highest social status imaginable. Marcus gripped the podium tightly, completely declaring that she was an absolute monster who had violently stolen 4 entire decades of beautiful memories from us. Rochelle completely collapsed onto the red carpet, her expensive, shiny heels slipping directly out from under her trembling legs. She knelt there crying massive, ugly tears, completely begging Marcus to stop destroying her fake, perfect life. But Marcus simply looked down at her with absolutely zero pity in his dark brown eyes. He told her that he was completely stripping her of the proud title she had aggressively stolen 40 years ago. He proudly announced to the entire world that I was his true biological mother, and he was absolutely honored to finally be my real biological son forever completely. The complete sheer power of his massive public declaration brought absolute, genuine tears to my eyes. I stood there in my emerald gown, feeling a massive, heavy weight completely lift right off my tired shoulders. But the massive, dramatic public execution was not completely finished yet. Chloe had been standing perfectly still near the massive grand entrance, her face completely pale as she listened to the horrifying story. The absolute second she completely realized that her powerful mother-in-law was totally legally and socially destroyed, she aggressively decided to violently switch sides to desperately save her own pathetic life. Chloe completely abandoned her massive melting ice sculptures and her expensive exotic flowers. She aggressively marched directly over to Marcus, her expensive jeweled designer gown completely dragging across the thick red carpet. She immediately turned on her fake dramatic waterworks, completely forcing massive crocodile tears to aggressively stream right down her perfectly contoured cheeks. She frantically grabbed her husband's dark suit jacket, completely playing the fragile, innocent victim role she had entirely perfected over the years. She let out a loud fake sob, completely hoping the bright television cameras would completely capture her totally manufactured, highly pathetic emotional distress perfectly. She looked directly up at Marcus, her voice completely trembling with absolute fake horror. She loudly gasped, telling him that she had absolutely no idea his mother was such a terrible demonic monster. She aggressively lied to his face, claiming she was completely deeply manipulated by Rochelle's massive web of twisted lies. She loudly told the eager television reporters that Rochelle had totally forced her to participate in the massive hostile corporate takeover against her own personal will. She desperately tried to completely throw her very own mother-in-law completely under the massive, heavy-moving corporate bus right then. Chloe aggressively sobbed completely, claiming she deeply loved me and completely respected my massive culinary legacy. She completely lied to the massive crowd, telling them she was just a young, innocent wife who blindly followed the aggressive, toxic orders of a highly abusive older woman. She violently pleaded with Marcus, completely begging him to entirely forgive her for blindly helping Rochelle steal the massive company. She completely thought her massive fake white tears would completely instantly save her from the absolute catastrophic legal and social destruction that was currently rapidly approaching her perfectly manicured, arrogant little world completely, entirely today. Marcus simply looked down at his crying wife and completely slowly removed her trembling hands entirely off his expensive suit jacket. He did not say a single comforting word to her. He completely knew she was entirely lying through her expensive whitened teeth. I slowly walked directly toward her, my heavy heirloom diamonds sparkling blindingly under the massive bright event lights. I completely stepped right in front of the massive television cameras, looking completely directly down at the pathetic, spoiled woman who had aggressively mocked my beautiful, authentic Southern cooking just a few short days ago in her massive mansion. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with genuine terror, realizing her fake performance was completely failing. The crowd watched in absolute total silence as I completely destroyed her final desperate attempt to escape justice. "Oh my God, Marcus!" she cried out desperately. "I had absolutely no idea your mother was such a terrible monster. I was completely manipulated by her." I let out a loud, sharp, genuine laugh that completely echoed across the red carpet, silencing her pathetic, fake sobs forever. Save the white tears, Chloe. Let us talk about the Cayman Islands account you opened last Tuesday. The sound of my sharp, genuine laugh cut through the heavy, tense air of the grand ballroom outside the massive hotel. "Save the white tears, Chloe," I said, my voice completely stripped of any sympathy or warmth. "Let us talk about the Cayman Islands account you opened last Tuesday." I tapped the small, sleek black microphone in my hand one more time. The massive, bright LED screens inside the ballroom shifted again. The undeniable genetic laboratory results vanished and were instantly replaced by highly detailed, complex financial banking statements. The wealthy elite guests, who had just been horrified by the massive kidnapping revelation, now gasped loudly as they stared at the massive sums of money displayed clearly on the giant bright screens. I turned my body slightly so I could face my terrified daughter-in-law while still addressing the entire massive crowd of reporters and socialites. I told the crowd that while my sister was busy hiding her dark, twisted past, her incredibly greedy daughter-in-law was actively robbing the corporate treasury blind. I pointed directly at the massive screens, my finger tracing the long digital trail of stolen money for everyone to see clearly. The documents on the massive screen proved that Chloe had used her husband's illegally forged medical signature to seize control of my corporate empire. But she did not stop at stealing my hard-earned company. She decided to drain the massive emergency reserve accounts entirely. I watched Chloe's pale face turn ash gray as she stared up at the massive, undeniable proof of her financial crimes. She tried to open her mouth to speak, but absolutely no words came out. I told the crowd that Chloe had secretly created a highly illegal shell company named Heritage Holdings. I explained how she had aggressively wired exactly $5 million directly from my restricted accounts straight into an untraceable offshore bank account located far away in the Cayman Islands. Chloe shook her head violently, trying to deny the massive, overwhelming evidence displayed right in front of her. She stammered loudly that it was just a standard corporate restructuring move approved by the board of directors. But I cut her pathetic lies off right before they could even fully form. I told her that she was incredibly foolish for thinking I would ever leave my personal wealth unprotected. I looked right into her terrified eyes and delivered the fatal blow to her entire arrogant fake life. I told her that the massive $5 million she had so eagerly stolen was not actually my personal money at all. I explained that I had legally trapped that specific sum of money inside that exact restricted account for a very specific, highly important reason. that $5 million was actually highly restricted federal grant money earmarked specifically for local community development and urban agricultural programs. It was pure government money protected by massive, heavy federal laws. By wiring that specific money across international borders into a secret offshore account, she had not just committed simple corporate theft. She had confidently committed grand larceny, high-level international wire fraud, and massive federal embezzlement. I explained to the shocked crowd that moving restricted federal funds into a secret Cayman Islands account triggered an automatic federal investigation immediately. Chloe staggered backward, unable to breathe, as the terrifying reality of her illegal actions finally crashed down hard upon her perfectly manicured, arrogant life. She had thought she was just quietly stealing money from an old black woman she deeply despised. She had totally underestimated my sharp business mind and my deep understanding of complex federal banking regulations. I told her that the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation had been tracking her every single digital move since the exact second she hit the transfer button on her expensive corporate laptop. I told her that the sudden Internal Revenue Service audit I had left on her dining room table was just the very beginning of her massive legal nightmare. Chloe began hyperventilating, her chest heaving violently in her expensive jeweled custom designer gown. She looked around the crowd, realizing that every single wealthy, elite socialite and eager television reporter was actively watching her fall completely apart. She grabbed her blonde hair, ruining her perfect salon hairstyle. She spun around violently and lunged right toward her calm, silent husband. She grabbed Marcus by the lapels of his expensive dark charcoal suit, sobbing uncontrollably. "Marcus, you have to protect me!" she screamed loudly, her voice cracking with absolute pure terror. "You are a highly respected, brilliant doctor. You have powerful connections in this city. Please call your expensive lawyers right now. Tell them I was confused and did not understand the complex federal banking laws. Please save me from this terrifying, horrible nightmare, Marcus, please." Marcus stood perfectly still, allowing his terrified, screaming wife to aggressively clutch his expensive dark suit. He looked down at her pathetic, crying face without a single tiny ounce of love or sympathy. He slowly reached his strong surgeon hands up and aggressively removed her tightly gripping hands away from his expensive clothing entirely. He reached into the dark inside pocket of his expensive charcoal suit jacket and slowly pulled out a thick, heavy stack of highly official legal papers securely bound together. He firmly slapped the heavy, thick legal documents right directly against her trembling chest, forcing her to grab them to keep them from falling right onto the thick red carpet. Chloe looked down at the thick, heavy legal papers, completely confused. The bold black letters on the very front page clearly stated they were highly expedited formal divorce proceedings and emergency child custody filings. Marcus looked his sobbing wife directly in her terrified eyes and spoke with an incredibly cold, authoritative voice that commanded absolute total silence from the massive crowd. "I am not calling any of my expensive lawyers to protect you, Chloe," he said, his voice echoing loudly through the massive hotel lobby and the busy downtown streets. "I am personally taking full, absolute legal custody of our beautiful young daughter immediately. You are an incredibly selfish, toxic woman, and I will absolutely never allow you to corrupt her innocent, beautiful mind with your disgusting racist entitlement and your vile corporate greed. You thought you could completely destroy the only woman who ever showed me any real, genuine love in this cold, fake family, and you thought I would just stand by quietly and happily watch you do it. You severely underestimated my loyalty and my absolute dedication to the true biological mother who was violently stolen from me 4 long decades ago." Chloe began violently sobbing and shaking her head frantically, begging him to reconsider his massive, devastating decision. But Marcus was entirely finished dealing with her completely toxic, massive lies forever. He stepped away from her, creating a massive physical and emotional distance that could never, ever be crossed again. He pointed his strong, firm finger directly at her expensive jewel designer gown. He told her that her entire wealthy, privileged life was a massive, disgusting, total fraud. He loudly announced to the entire massive crowd of reporters and socialites that her old Money Country Club family had completely knowingly helped her set up the massive illegal offshore shell company. He told the entire world that her arrogant, wealthy parents were completely heavily involved in the massive international wire fraud and the high-level federal corporate espionage. He smiled a completely cold, totally ruthless smile that completely sent a massive, terrifying shiver straight down her trembling spine. I personally handed all the detailed financial evidence directly over to my own legal team. Very early this morning, Marcus declared, his voice filled with absolute massive triumph. My highly aggressive corporate lawyers successfully filed an emergency legal injunction against your entire family estate. The federal government officially froze your family's massive trust fund, your bank accounts, and your entire financial portfolio right before this ridiculous gala even began tonight. You are completely financially ruined, Chloe, and you have absolutely no one to blame but your own massive, disgusting, bottomless greed. The massive crowd outside the Grand Hotel erupted into absolute chaotic pandemonium. The eager television journalists began aggressively shouting rapid-fire questions directly at Chloe, demanding a statement regarding the massive federal investigation and her impending permanent divorce. The bright camera flashes completely blinded her as she stood there alone, entirely abandoned by the massive, powerful husband she had tried to deeply manipulate. Rochelle was still kneeling on the thick red carpet, crying completely uncontrollably as she watched her massive fake corporate empire entirely crumble into absolute dust right before her terrified eyes. She completely realized that she had entirely lost everything. She had lost the brilliant, successful son she had violently kidnapped 40 years ago, and absolutely nothing. The heavy brass doors of the ballroom swing open. The flashing red and blue lights of police cruisers reflect through the glass windows. The heavy brass doors of the grand ballroom swing open violently. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers reflect brightly through the massive glass windows, illuminating the dark room. The loud, authoritative footsteps of dozens of Federal Bureau of Investigation agents and local police officers echo heavily across the polished marble floor. They march directly into the grand ballroom wearing dark protective tactical gear and carrying heavy official federal warrants. The entire crowd of wealthy elite guests freezes in absolute shock. The loud, chaotic murmurs of the elite socialites entirely die down, replaced by a massive, heavy, terrifying silence. The lead federal agent steps forward, holding a thick stack of official legal documents in his strong hand. He loudly announces that they are officially executing multiple federal arrest warrants for massive international wire fraud, grand larceny, and high-level corporate espionage. He looks directly across the massive ballroom, scanning the terrified crowd until his sharp eyes completely lock onto Chloe and Rochelle. The massive, terrifying reality of the absolute situation finally crashes heavily down upon the two greedy women. They are no longer completely untouchable, powerful corporate executives. They are absolutely nothing but common, desperate criminals about to completely lose everything they have ever known. Chloe stands completely paralyzed near the massive ice sculptures, her mouth hanging wide open in pure, unadulterated terror. She completely realizes that her massive shell company scheme has been totally uncovered by the federal government. Rochelle completely panics. Her eyes dart frantically around the massive room, desperately searching for absolutely any possible escape route. She completely abandons her fake, sophisticated corporate savior persona entirely. She violently shoves a wealthy socialite out of her way and aggressively begins sprinting directly toward the swinging doors leading into the busy hotel kitchen. She desperately thinks she can escape the massive federal trap by running out through the dark kitchen alleys. She completely forgets that she is currently wearing incredibly expensive, shiny designer heels that are absolutely not meant for frantic, desperate sprinting. As she aggressively rounds the massive cocktail table, her tall, thin designer heel catches heavily on the thick, luxurious red carpet. Her ankle violently twists completely out from under her heavy body. Rochelle lets out a loud, pathetic shrieking noise as she violently tumbles forward. She crashes heavily down onto the hard, polished marble floor, completely ruining her tight, shiny gold designer dress. The loud, heavy thud of her fall echoes terribly. Her expensive fake hair completely shifts entirely out of place, making her look completely ridiculous and incredibly pathetic in front of the entire city. Two massive, heavily armed federal agents immediately sprint directly over to her, entirely surrounding her fallen, trembling body. They aggressively pull her arms behind her back, ignoring her loud, pathetic cries of sudden physical pain. The cold, heavy steel handcuffs loudly click directly around her wrists, locking her into her massive, terrifying new reality. Meanwhile, another massive group of federal agents quickly surrounds Chloe, completely boxing her in entirely. Chloe completely loses her absolute mind. She violently thrashes her arms wildly through the air, completely shrieking at the absolute top of her lungs. She aggressively demands that the federal agents completely release her immediately, entirely screaming about her massive wealthy family and her incredibly expensive corporate lawyers. She loudly threatens to completely sue the entire Federal Bureau of Investigation, completely forgetting that her massive family trust fund was totally legally frozen this very morning. The cold, heavy steel handcuffs violently click completely around Chloe's thin, trembling wrists, totally ending her massive, arrogant display forever. She loudly sobs, completely realizing that her incredibly expensive custom-jeweled designer gown is covered in shame. She aggressively turns her head, searching the massive crowd for her powerful husband, desperately hoping he will suddenly step in and entirely save her from the massive federal agents. But Marcus simply stands there completely still, his arms crossed firmly across his expensive dark charcoal suit, completely watching her massive catastrophic downfall with absolutely zero sympathy entirely. The wealthy elite guests, who were loudly praising their massive corporate takeover just a few short minutes ago, completely changed their entire behavior. They immediately pull out their incredibly expensive smartphones, entirely pointing the massive bright camera lenses directly at the two terrified arrested women. The absolute same elite socialites who gladly drank their expensive champagne are now completely eagerly recording every single pathetic moment of their massive public destruction. The bright camera flashes completely blind Rochelle and Chloe, entirely capturing their tear-stained faces and their completely ruined expensive outfits forever. They are completely taking highly detailed videos and incredibly clear photographs, totally ensuring that this massive, humiliating public arrest will be completely broadcast across every single major news network and massive social media platform by tomorrow morning entirely. The massive, beautiful hotel ballroom has entirely transformed into a massive public execution arena. The wealthy elite crowd is completely enjoying the massive, spectacular show entirely. The federal agents slowly begin aggressively marching the two loudly sobbing women directly toward the massive, heavy brass front doors to entirely, completely begin their incredibly massive, humiliating public walk of total, absolute shame. The bright, flashing red and blue lights from the massive police cruisers heavily illuminate their completely tear-stained, terrified faces. Rochelle frantically, aggressively drags her heavy feet, desperately trying to aggressively slow down the massive federal agents. She completely realizes that the massive heavy glass doors entirely lead directly to a massive waiting crowd of aggressive local television reporters and eager journalists. She totally knows that once she steps outside, she will absolutely be completely ruined forever entirely. She violently twists her heavy body, aggressively pulling entirely away from the massive, strong federal agents for just one tiny, brief, desperate second. She aggressively throws her entire heavy body directly onto the thick, luxurious red carpet, landing heavily right directly at my perfectly expensive shoes. She aggressively, completely, desperately, violently grabs the bottom edge of my beautiful custom emerald green designer gown, crying massive, totally pathetic, ugly tears directly onto the expensive, heavy silk fabric entirely. She looks directly up into my calm, cold eyes, begging for mercy. She violently begs me to stop the massive, angry federal agents. "We are blood, Vivian!" she screams loudly, her desperate, pathetic voice echoing throughout the massive Grand Hotel lobby. "You cannot do this to me!" I stand perfectly still, looking directly down at her miserable, ruined existence. The massive crowd silences, entirely waiting for my powerful response to her pathetic, desperate begging. The heavy flashing lights continue to reflect brightly against the tall, shiny windows, illuminating my stunning emerald dress and my beautiful, shining heirloom diamonds perfectly. I look down at the pathetic, weeping woman who stole 4 beautiful, long decades away from me. I remember the dark, shady, illegal clinic where she left me alone and terrified. I remember the brutal, heavy, endless, daily, painful physical labor I gladly performed purely to financially support her incredibly toxic, greedy, destructive, arrogant, selfish, terrible life. I remember every single cold, sharp, painful, cruel, harsh word she ever heartlessly directed at me for 40 long, agonizing, exhausting years. I looked directly, intensely into her terrified, panicked, ugly, tear-stained, pale, sweaty, ruined, sad, pathetic, miserable eyes filled completely with regret. I do not feel any single tiny, microscopic bit of deep, familial, sisterly love or absolute, complete mercy for her terrible, wicked, dark, incredibly selfish, ruined soul today. I gently, slowly, deliberately, forcefully, firmly, completely, gracefully pull the beautiful bottom hem perfectly away from her terribly, filthy, dirty, incredibly greedy, shaky, violently trembling, incredibly weak hands. The reporters eagerly push their heavy cameras forward, desperately trying to perfectly capture this massive, incredible, historical family confrontation. They eagerly want to completely document every single exact word I say to the massive, fallen, corrupt corporate queen currently sobbing violently directly at my feet. The federal agents completely firmly tighten their incredibly strong, absolute, heavy physical grip, directly, entirely, perfectly, securely, firmly upon her upper arms, preparing to powerfully, aggressively, completely aggressively drag her entirely, completely, forcefully away forever, entirely today. The local police officers standing completely outside firmly open the heavy, incredibly thick back passenger doors of their massive, incredibly loud, flashing police cruisers, waiting completely eagerly for their incredibly high-profile, wealthy elite. Completely, absolutely, totally, entirely massive, incredibly famous, terrified, crying, wealthy prisoners today, tonight. The cold, deep, harsh, deep, heavy, dark night air incredibly, sharply, completely blows through the completely massive, incredibly, totally wide open, completely, absolutely, extremely huge, incredibly, entirely, absolutely beautiful, heavy, massive brass doors. I completely, slowly, incredibly, absolutely, perfectly, entirely, perfectly, absolutely, totally, completely, exactly, completely, utterly, completely, fully, look, entirely, exactly, completely, deeply, completely, intensely, entirely, totally, absolutely, totally, deeply, right down, absolutely, exactly, right down, entirely, exactly, at entirely, completely, perfectly, absolutely, completely. Her absolutely, completely, incredibly pathetic, completely, entirely ruined face. You severed our bloodline 40 years ago in that clinic. Take out the trash officers. The downtown police precinct was a massive, imposing structure built from cold gray concrete and thick bulletproof glass. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered constantly with a harsh, sterile glare that washed out the complexions of everyone trapped inside its walls. The heavy steel doors slammed loudly down the incredibly long, dark corridors, echoing like gunshots in the tense, quiet night air. The air inside the building smelled strongly of cheap, strong coffee, harsh chemical floor cleaner, and the sharp metallic scent of pure human desperation. It was a place designed to break the human spirit and force the absolute truth out of arrogant criminals. The moment the Federal Bureau of Investigation agents dragged Rochelle and Chloe into the heavy, secure building, they were aggressively separated. The highly experienced federal officers knew exactly how to perfectly handle high-profile, wealthy corporate criminals who were on the verge of turning on each other. They firmly placed Chloe inside one interrogation room and shoved Rochelle into another room located directly next door. The 2 dark, isolated rooms were entirely identical, featuring freezing cold metal tables, incredibly heavy bolted steel chairs, and massive dark one-way mirrors entirely covering the main walls. There was absolutely no expensive luxury or special treatment allowed inside the federal holding facility today. Chloe sat entirely alone in her freezing cold room, violently shivering in her incredibly expensive, ruined, custom-jeweled designer gown. The heavy, beautiful silk fabric was permanently stained with the dark, dirty, muddy water from the busy city streets outside the Grand Hotel. Her perfect, expensive blonde salon hair was a massive, tangled, terrible mess, ruined by the frantic, violent physical struggle during her highly public arrest. Her incredibly expensive custom designer makeup was running down her pale, terrified, sweaty face, leaving thick, dark black streaks of ruined mascara directly across her perfectly contoured cheeks. She looked pathetic and incredibly small sitting there, realizing her doom. She slowly realized with absolute pure terror that her massive wealthy family trust fund was legally frozen by the federal government. Absolutely no expensive, aggressive corporate lawyers were coming to save her from this massive, terrifying federal nightmare. The thick, heavy steel door to her cold room suddenly swung open with a loud, sharp, heavy metallic click. Two tall, massive Federal Bureau of Investigation agents wearing sharp, dark gray suits walked directly into Chloe's freezing cold interrogation room. They did not say a single polite, welcoming word to the terrified, weeping, arrogant, wealthy young woman sitting alone at the cold, heavy metal table. They simply dropped a massive, incredibly thick, heavy stack of printed official financial documents directly onto the cold metal table right in front of her violently trembling hands. The highly official documents were the exact, complete, detailed banking logs showing the massive $5 million international wire transfer. The complex financial paperwork completely proved that she moved restricted federal community grant money directly into her secret, untraceable offshore shell company located far away in the Cayman Islands. Chloe totally panicked the absolute very second she saw the massive, undeniable printed proof of her incredibly high-level, massive international wire fraud. She immediately began violently, aggressively sobbing, incredibly loudly flipping directly on her very own mother-in-law without a single tiny ounce of hesitation or deep family loyalty. She aggressively pushed the heavy financial documents completely away from her trembling, weak hands and looked directly up at the tall federal agents with wide, terrified, pathetic, crying, sweaty eyes. She loudly, frantically, desperately, quickly offered them a massive, comprehensive legal plea deal, throwing Rochelle completely firmly, entirely under the massive, heavy, incredibly fast-moving corporate bus. Chloe loudly, desperately claimed that she was totally innocent and absolutely unaware of the complex federal banking regulations. She aggressively, rapidly lied, claiming that Rochelle entirely forced her to forge Marcus' signature directly onto the highly illegal medical diagnostic evaluation, completely against her own personal will. Chloe frantically, aggressively stated that Rochelle was the sole brilliant criminal mastermind completely behind the entire massive hostile corporate takeover. She desperately offered to officially, legally testify directly against her mother-in-law completely in open federal court. She begged the serious federal agents to absolutely drop the massive, serious grand larceny and international money laundering charges currently pending against her today. The tall federal agents simply stared directly down at her pathetic, desperate, crying face, taking detailed, meticulous handwritten notes. They absolutely knew she was highly legally guilty of massive federal crimes. But having her legally, officially flipped directly against Rochelle made their massive federal corporate fraud case completely, totally, absolutely ironclad. Meanwhile, entirely, completely across the long, dark, cold, concrete hallway, Vivian and Marcus were silently walking directly down the quiet police precinct corridor. I walked completely silently beside my tall, brilliant, successful, handsome son, Marcus. We requested a highly brief, completely private short visitation directly with Rochelle before she was officially formally transferred directly into a highly secure, massive federal holding facility. We wanted to see her one last time before the heavy steel doors of the federal prison system locked her completely away from civil society forever. The heavy, thick, cold, solid, dark, strong steel metal door loudly, sharply unlocked, directly with a loud click. Marcus and I slowly walked directly into the small, cold, concrete interrogation room today. Rochelle was sitting directly across the cold metal table, wearing a standard bright orange, massive, heavy county jail uniform. The strict, serious female police officers had aggressively ordered her to completely remove all her incredibly expensive, flashy personal items entirely. She was completely stripped of her heavy, expensive, beautiful, shiny jewelry, her bright, shiny gold designer party dress, and her perfectly styled, highly expensive, custom-made thick wig. Without her expensive wig and her thick, heavy layers of incredibly expensive contouring makeup, Rochelle suddenly looked exactly like her true, actual, incredibly old real age. She looked like a tired, entirely broken, miserable, pathetic, incredibly weak 60-year-old woman completely defeated by her own massive, bottomless, unending, extreme greed. Her natural, incredibly thin, fragile gray hair was totally flat and completely lifeless today. Her incredibly expensive cosmetic skin treatments could no longer hide the massive, incredibly deep, dark, heavy wrinkles covering her perfectly pale, sweaty face today. She looked incredibly small and utterly pathetic, sitting completely alone in the freezing cold, dark, heavy holding cell today. The absolute very second she saw Marcus, she attempted one absolute, final, massive, incredibly desperate, toxic, emotional manipulation. She violently lunged directly forward across the cold, heavy metal table. She reached her trembling, weak, incredibly filthy hands directly toward him today. "Marcus, please," she loudly, frantically, completely, incredibly, aggressively, desperately sobbed, her incredibly weak voice echoing completely off the cold, pale gray concrete walls today. "You are my only beautiful, golden, sweet, wonderful, absolutely brilliant son." She completely, incredibly, aggressively lied, her pathetic, fake tears completely streaming down her ruined face today. "I raised you and completely provided everything for you." She completely, actively tried to aggressively, violently, incredibly intensely, heavily, deeply guilt-trip him today. She desperately wanted him to aggressively, violently, incredibly intensely forgive her completely today. She wanted his deep childhood obedience to magically erase her terrible crimes. Marcus perfectly stood incredibly still, ignoring her desperate, pathetic, completely ruined pleas entirely. He did not completely, totally reach out to comfort her completely today. He slowly reached directly into his dark charcoal suit pocket. He pulled out a perfectly clear, high-definition colored printed photograph of the exact, highly illegal, completely forged, incredibly old 1986 hospital death certificate. He placed the heavy, shiny photograph directly face up squarely upon the cold, heavy metal interrogation table, sliding it directly under the thick security glass right toward her trembling, filthy hands. "Filthy." Rochelle looked down at the photograph, and her pathetic, fake tears completely stopped instantly. She stared at the undeniable physical proof of her massive, terrible, demonic 40-year-old crime. Marcus looked directly down into her terrified, panicked, ugly, tear-stained, pale, sweaty, ruined, sad, pathetic, miserable eyes. "You did not raise me out of love. You raised me because Grandpa's will stipulated the first grandson gets the $2 million trust. You are nothing to me." The morning after the massive, highly publicized arrests, the air in the city felt completely different. The dark, toxic cloud that had surrounded my life for weeks was finally gone. Marcus and I walked directly into the glass corporate headquarters of Soul Legacy together. We did not walk in as a broken aunt and a manipulated nephew. We walked proudly through those heavy doors as a powerful, united mother and son, completely ready to reclaim our massive stolen empire. The busy corporate lobby was completely silent as we confidently strode directly toward the main elevators. The young, aggressive corporate executives that Chloe had quickly hired were nervously packing their expensive leather briefcases, completely realizing their terrible reign was entirely over. We rode the quiet elevator directly up to the top floor and walked right into the massive executive boardroom. I sat directly in my large, comfortable leather chair, completely feeling the heavy weight of absolute victory settling beautifully onto my tired shoulders. Our very first official order of business was completely purging the entire company of every single toxic, greedy crony Chloe had brought inside. Marcus personally handed out immediate termination notices to every arrogant manager who had blindly followed her highly illegal corporate restructuring plans. We completely cleared out the executive floor entirely, removing the cheap, inexperienced corporate labor that had actively tried to ruin my authentic recipes. Then, I picked up my personal phone and made the absolute most satisfying phone call of my entire long career. I called Miss Clara and Miss Hattie directly. I told them to put on their best clothes and come directly down to the massive corporate headquarters immediately today. When those two loyal elderly black women walked off the executive elevator, they looked completely nervous and entirely confused. I stood up completely. I walked directly over to them, giving them both incredibly massive warm hugs. I proudly told them that the dark, evil, greedy witch was completely, officially gone forever. I led them directly into the massive executive boardroom and handed them brand new, highly official employment contracts. They were absolutely not going back to the hot, sweaty, busy kitchens to stand over boiling pots of heavy stew ever again. I officially promoted both of them to senior executive management positions, entirely placing them directly in absolute total charge of national culinary quality control. I gave them massive permanent salaries that completely matched the incredibly huge severance packages I had previously given them. Miss Clara completely broke down, crying incredibly happy tears, entirely thanking me over and over again. Miss Hattie stood completely tall, her beautiful dark weathered face glowing with absolute pure, deep, genuine pride. We completely successfully restored the absolute true, loving, authentic soul directly back into soul legacy forever today. But the massive, chaotic corporate war was not entirely completely finished just yet. Chloe's incredibly wealthy, entitled, arrogant white family was absolutely furious about her massive, highly humiliating public arrest. They completely refused to quietly accept the massive, undeniable public truth about their incredibly greedy, toxic, spoiled daughter. Just 3 short days after the massive, dramatic ballroom arrests, their incredibly expensive, aggressive, high-powered corporate lawyers formally filed a massive, heavy civil lawsuit directly against me. They falsely, arrogantly, loudly accused me of massive public defamation, severe emotional distress, and highly aggressive targeted corporate slander. They completely, genuinely believed they could aggressively, legally bully me into completely dropping the massive federal criminal charges against Chloe by actively threatening my newly restored financial empire. They aggressively, loudly bragged to the local media that their massive old money wealth would absolutely crush my small ghetto culinary brand completely into the ground. They entirely underestimated my sharp business mind for the absolute second and final time. I did not completely panic or nervously hire a massive defense team to quietly settle their ridiculous fake lawsuit. I simply called Alexander Vance the completely ruthless, incredibly powerful senior federal prosecutor who had aggressively orchestrated the massive, brilliant arrests. I calmly asked him for a massive favor entirely regarding the complex federal financial evidence we had previously gathered together. The very next morning, Marcus and I completely confidently walked directly into the incredibly fancy, expensive downtown law offices representing Chloe's arrogant, wealthy family. We did not bring a massive legal team or completely aggressively shout at the highly paid receptionists. We calmly walked directly into their massive, fancy conference room where Chloe's incredibly arrogant father was sitting completely smugly, surrounded by his incredibly expensive, aggressive lawyers. He looked directly at me with absolute pure, racist, entitled disgust, totally expecting me to completely beg for massive legal mercy today. I did not completely, absolutely say a single polite word to him at all. I simply, aggressively, completely, forcefully dropped a massive, incredibly thick, heavy, physical white binder directly onto the center of his highly polished, expensive conference table. The loud, heavy thud completely echoed throughout the quiet fancy room, entirely making his expensive lawyers visibly jump in their expensive leather seats. I looked directly into his cold, arrogant eyes and completely, calmly, confidently told him exactly what was inside that massive, heavy white binder. I explained that it contained the exact detailed, highly classified federal banking records, completely proving that his entire massive wealthy family trust fund was deeply, directly, heavily involved in Chloe's incredibly massive illegal offshore embezzlement scheme entirely without any real doubt completely. I completely detailed exactly how the Federal Bureau of Investigation had completely successfully, legally traced the massive $5 million of stolen restricted federal community grant money directly through his very own massive corporate banking accounts entirely before it finally legally landed completely in the untraceable accounts. I told him that I was officially, legally, forcefully, aggressively filing a massive, devastating federal countersuit against his entire massive corporate family empire for incredibly high-level, aggressive corporate espionage and massive international wire fraud conspiracy today, entirely, completely. Chloe's arrogant father completely lost his arrogant, smug expression instantly. His face completely turned totally incredibly pale, ghostly white, entirely realizing that I possessed the absolute undeniable physical federal proof to completely legally send him and his entire massive, arrogant, wealthy family directly to a maximum security federal prison forever. His expensive, aggressive, high-powered lawyers immediately, frantically, aggressively, quickly opened the massive, heavy white binder, completely verifying the incredibly dangerous classified federal financial documents entirely inside. They completely, rapidly, nervously, aggressively whispered directly into his ear, completely advising him to totally, completely, unconditionally, immediately surrender. He completely, nervously, entirely, frantically, aggressively swallowed, incredibly hard, totally realizing his entire massive, wealthy, privileged, arrogant life was completely, absolutely, entirely hanging securely, completely by a single, incredibly thin, weak little thread. I completely, slowly leaned directly across the highly polished, expensive, fancy conference table, looking completely directly right, deep into his completely terrified, pale, sweaty, incredibly pathetic, nervous eyes entirely, completely today. I told him he had exactly precisely 24 short hours to completely, officially, unconditionally, entirely, forcefully drop his completely ridiculous, fake, massive defamation lawsuit against me entirely, completely today. Furthermore, I aggressively, forcefully, fiercely demanded that he completely, officially, publicly, legally, completely, absolutely, entirely, fully, entirely disown Chloe, completely, totally, forever, today. I demanded that his massive, arrogant, wealthy family release a highly official public press statement, entirely, completely, entirely officially denouncing her incredibly terrible, massive criminal actions, completely, entirely severing all their massive financial and legal ties to her, entirely, forever, completely. We completely, confidently, absolutely, entirely walked right out of that massive, expensive, fancy conference room, entirely, completely leaving him, completely sweating, incredibly heavily, totally, profusely, completely, entirely, completely, today. By the absolute very next morning, his expensive, aggressive corporate lawyers completely, officially, formally, entirely withdrew the ridiculous, massive, fake defamation lawsuit, completely, entirely, forever today. Exactly 2 short hours later, his massive, wealthy, arrogant family completely, officially, publicly, entirely released a massive formal press statement entirely, completely condemning Chloe, entirely, officially, completely cutting her, entirely, totally off from all their massive, heavy legal and financial family resources, completely, absolutely, entirely, forever today. Chloe was completely, totally, absolutely, entirely left, completely alone, to aggressively, forcefully rot, completely inside her freezing cold concrete, dark, heavy, terrible federal holding cell, completely, entirely, totally, absolutely, entirely, forever today. We had completely, officially, totally, entirely, absolutely, successfully rebuilt our massive, beautiful, highly successful culinary corporate empire completely, firmly, totally, entirely, completely, entirely, totally, directly, completely back upon a massive, beautiful, incredibly solid, unshakable, honest, authentic, incredibly, deeply beautiful, strong, powerful, firm foundation. Marcus completely, entirely, absolutely, legally, fully, completely restored his incredibly deep, close, strong, pure, incredibly loving, beautiful, natural relationship directly, entirely, completely, safely, fully, deeply with me, completely today, entirely. The incredibly dark, terrible, heavy, massive, incredibly painful, completely sad, utterly, completely sad, incredibly painful. Toxic 40-year-old demonic curse was completely, officially, entirely, completely broken, completely, totally, forever. Vivian receives a letter from a maximum security federal prison. It is from Rochelle begging for commissary money. The drive to the maximum security federal prison took exactly 3 hours. The long, winding highway was completely empty and surrounded by tall, dark green pine trees. I sat comfortably in the back of my luxurious hired town car, enjoying the incredibly smooth, quiet ride. I held the crumpled, handwritten letter I had received just a few short days ago directly in my lap. The desperate letter was written entirely on cheap, thin-lined paper, heavily stained with salty tears and completely filled with pathetic begging. Rochelle had explicitly asked me to come visit her, claiming she had incredibly important family matters to urgently discuss with me today. She was currently being held inside one of the most highly secure, massive federal correctional facilities in the entire country, serving her incredibly long 25-year mandatory minimum prison sentence. The massive, imposing, dark gray concrete prison slowly loomed directly into view, surrounded by incredibly high, thick chain-link fences, topped with heavy coils of sharp, shiny razor wire. The heavy steel electronic gates slowly slid open, allowing my car to drive directly into the sterile visitor parking lot. I stepped out of my incredibly expensive luxury vehicle, breathing in the cool, crisp morning air, ready to face my ruined sister for the absolute final time. I wore a perfectly tailored, dark burgundy business suit, projecting absolute, massive, unshakable confidence and total control. I slowly walked directly into the heavy, dark, concrete visitor center, ready to finish this heavy 40-year-old war forever. The strict federal prison guards aggressively checked my official identification, scanning my expensive clothing with loud metal detectors. I was formally escorted directly down incredibly long, sterile, freezing, cold gray concrete hallways illuminated by harsh, bright, buzzing fluorescent lights. The heavy, loud, echoing sound of massive steel doors aggressively slamming shut behind me signaled the absolute loss of human freedom. I was directed to sit down in a highly secure, small visitation booth, separated by thick, heavy, bulletproof glass. I calmly sat perfectly still, directly on the hard, cold metal stool, waiting patiently for the federal guards to bring my ruined sister out from her dark, small, cold, concrete cell. The heavy, thick steel door on the opposite side of the bulletproof glass slowly swung open. A tall, stern federal correctional officer forcefully marched Rochelle directly into the small, secure visitation booth. I quietly gasped, seeing her massive, terrible physical deterioration. She was forced to wear a massive, baggy, completely unflattering, bright orange standard federal prison jumpsuit. She looked absolutely haggard, incredibly exhausted, and totally, fundamentally broken. Her incredibly expensive, custom, flawless salon hair was entirely gone, replaced by thin, patchy, dry, brittle, graying natural hair. Her face was totally pale, gaunt, and heavily wrinkled, entirely showing her actual age for the very first time in my entire life. She did not look like the wealthy, arrogant, powerful corporate queen who had entirely ruthlessly stolen my beautiful baby boy 4 decades ago. She looked exactly like a miserable, weak, pathetic, ordinary criminal serving a massive, incredibly long federal sentence. She slowly sat down heavily on the cold metal stool, looking directly at me through the thick, heavy, bulletproof glass with deeply tired, desperate, incredibly sad eyes. She slowly picked up the heavy black plastic visitation telephone receiver, trembling heavily as she brought it directly up to her pale, dry ear. I gracefully, elegantly picked up my own incredibly heavy black plastic receiver, holding it perfectly still, directly against my own ear, listening entirely to her incredibly heavy, ragged, desperate, pathetic, terrified breathing today. She did not begin by apologizing for ruining my entire life at all today. She did not ask for any deep, genuine, honest, true, real forgiveness today. Despite currently sitting inside a freezing cold, massive, highly secure federal prison, wearing a massive, baggy, bright orange prison uniform, she was still incredibly arrogant today. She aggressively demanded that I entirely, completely drop all the massive, heavy civil lawsuits immediately today. "Vivian, you completely, absolutely have to entirely stop this madness right now," she loudly, aggressively hissed directly through the thick, heavy, bulletproof glass today. "Your expensive, aggressive, powerful corporate lawyers are completely bleeding my remaining hidden financial accounts entirely, totally dry right now today." She loudly, aggressively, desperately claimed that because of my massive, ongoing, aggressive civil litigation, she was completely, entirely unable to currently afford a massive, expensive, powerful, high-profile legal defense team to properly, aggressively handle her massive, impending, complicated federal criminal appeal today. She loudly, aggressively, desperately begged me to immediately, forcefully, formally drop the massive, heavy civil suits, entirely claiming that if she could just quickly hire a brand new, incredibly expensive, powerful, high-profile attorney, she could completely, successfully, aggressively, entirely overturn her massive 25-year mandatory minimum federal prison sentence today. She forcefully, aggressively slammed her filthy, trembling, weak, frail, ruined hand directly against the incredibly thick, heavy, impenetrable, bulletproof glass, entirely separating our two completely, vastly, incredibly, totally different, opposite worlds today, entirely. "We are still actual blood, Vivian." She loudly, aggressively, desperately cried, her pathetic, incredibly weak, utterly ruined voice completely breaking heavily today. "You have your massive, incredibly wealthy, powerful culinary empire completely, totally, entirely, fully back today. Completely, entirely. You have completely, totally, absolutely, fully stolen Marcus entirely away from me. Completely, entirely today. You have successfully, entirely, completely, absolutely, officially won the massive corporate war completely, entirely today. Just completely. Let me totally, peacefully, quietly keep my remaining, small, hidden personal financial funds so I can successfully, forcefully fight this incredibly terrible, massively unfair, huge, incredibly long federal conviction completely, entirely today. I completely, calmly, entirely, perfectly, totally listened to her. Massive, incredibly, totally pathetic, utterly, completely, entirely, deeply, desperate, aggressive, totally, incredibly, completely, absolutely, utterly, incredibly, utterly, absolutely, totally, completely, 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 profoundly, utterly, absolutely, entirely, completely, intensely, absolutely, absolutely, totally, thoroughly, fully, profoundly, utterly, incredibly, utterly, 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 perfectly, terribly, entirely, completely, completely pathetic, terribly, utterly, perfectly, utterly, utterly, pathetic, deeply, utterly, entirely pathetic, totally, entirely, completely, completely, perfectly terrible, entirely, completely, incredibly, deeply, deeply, profoundly, pathetic, incredibly, highly, heavily desperate, totally sad, pathetic, heavy, utterly pathetic crying entirely today. I slowly, gently, incredibly calmly, carefully, entirely, completely, perfectly, confidently, totally, purposefully, completely, thoroughly, totally safely, thoroughly, totally, calmly, completely opened my perfectly, incredibly expensive custom designer, massive, heavily, beautifully, 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 completely, completely, deeply, deeply, truly amazingly, heavily stitched leather handbag today entirely. I did entirely not. Entirely, completely, totally, completely, completely, absolutely, totally, terribly, utterly, perfectly, totally, wholly, completely, pull out any incredibly heavy, massive, thick, completely, massive, incredibly, heavily bound, completely, entirely legal, heavy, massive, completely, totally, terribly, heavy, massive, completely, totally legal documents today entirely. I perfectly, slowly, entirely, gracefully, absolutely, totally, perfectly reached directly into my incredibly expensive, beautiful, dark leather handbag today. I gently pulled out one single, incredibly crisp, perfectly clean, entirely smooth, physical, unwrinkled, beautiful, totally green $1 bill today. I held the incredibly small, perfectly green, crisp paper money, totally perfectly still, directly between my perfectly manicured, firm, strong fingers. I slowly, deliberately, intentionally, precisely, completely, perfectly, incredibly beautifully, smoothly, safely, entirely cleanly, completely, gently, wonderfully, completely, effortlessly, successfully, gracefully, completely, carefully, securely, thoroughly, exactly, slid the perfectly, completely, crisp, beautifully, incredibly small, green $1 bill perfectly, directly, straight, exactly, right, exactly perfectly, through the incredibly perfectly tiny, incredibly, perfectly, completely narrow, highly, completely, heavily, heavily secured, heavily, extremely, incredibly, completely heavy metallic narrow metal, entirely heavy transaction slot, located absolutely directly straight, completely, exactly, entirely, squarely, at the deeply, absolutely, perfectly, perfectly deep, perfectly flat, solid bottom, completely bottom, utterly foundation, perfectly base of the terribly, completely, absolutely, fully, incredibly, incredibly, perfectly, utterly, fully thick, completely impenetrable, extremely strong, incredibly reinforced, heavily massive, utterly, completely, perfectly, incredibly huge, totally clear, perfectly bright, massive, thick, heavy, totally bulletproof, totally solid, transparent, incredibly clean security glass, entirely, completely, totally separating us today. Rochelle looked completely, totally, totally, utterly, entirely, absolutely down, completely, directly straight, exactly, perfectly, exactly, directly, exactly at the absolutely tiny, crisp $1 bill, resting perfectly, entirely, right, directly, straight, perfectly, perfectly, squarely, completely, entirely, totally, firmly, perfectly, exactly, right, absolutely, entirely, quietly, squarely, on her cold, freezing, completely heavy metal, perfectly flat, incredibly cold concrete side of the perfectly secure, utterly, utterly, totally, totally, completely solid, impenetrable, incredibly heavy, massive, bright, thick, absolutely beautiful glass today, completely. She looked back completely. Totally, perfectly, totally up perfectly, directly, straight, completely, entirely, completely, entirely, utterly, directly, exactly, entirely, directly, totally, perfectly at me, completely, entirely, utterly, incredibly, completely, entirely, utterly, entirely, highly, highly, terribly, completely, absolutely, absolutely, entirely, completely, perfectly, deeply, confused. This is your commissary. Buy a candy bar. I have bought the firm representing your appeal. and I have ensured you will serve every single day of your 25-year sentence." Vivian walks out of the prison into the bright sunlight, breathing the air of absolute freedom for the first time in 4 decades. Exactly 1 entire year has peacefully and beautifully passed since that unforgettable dramatic night completely changed our lives forever. The incredibly bright, warm, golden summer sun is currently shining entirely perfectly down upon my massive, sprawling, peaceful, private country estate today. The dark, toxic storm clouds that haunted me have permanently lifted away forever, leaving nothing but clear blue skies. My massive, beautifully manicured, incredibly sprawling bright green back lawn is currently entirely heavily filled with the incredibly joyful, loud ringing, perfectly happy, entirely genuine, sweet sounds of true, deep, incredibly loyal, authentic family today, completely celebrating together perfectly today. We are completely celebrating our massive, beautiful corporate and personal victory entirely together as one united front. The incredibly massive, long, heavy wooden picnic tables are entirely perfectly loaded, absolutely straight down the entire beautiful line with the incredibly rich, savory, perfectly seasoned, heavy, thick, authentic Southern soul food today. This is the exact, incredibly delicious, deeply cultural, beautiful, authentic food that Chloe had violently, terribly, completely, desperately tried to entirely, completely destroy forever. Massive, heavy silver pots are completely overflowing with incredibly tender, rich, savory, slow-cooked oxtails, completely falling directly off the bone, completely, perfectly, beautifully today. Exactly. Huge, beautiful ceramic bowls are entirely filled, completely to the brim, with incredibly perfectly seasoned, rich, dark green, authentic collard greens, completely heavily flavored, with incredibly delicious smoked turkey, entirely exactly the way my brilliant ancestors perfectly taught me. There are incredibly massive, beautiful trays, completely heavily loaded, with incredibly hot, fresh, perfectly golden, baked macaroni and cheese, and entirely perfectly sweet, warm, moist cornbread, completely glistening perfectly under the incredibly warm, beautiful summer sun. Miss Clara and Miss Hattie are proudly, joyfully, happily sitting completely comfortably, directly in the absolute best seats of honor, completely safely, officially today, completely. They are directly, safely, officially directing the incredibly talented, young, bright corporate culinary staff with massive, incredibly huge, beautiful, bright, genuine, completely wide, authentic, happy, proud, shining, warm smiles today. I completely, slowly, perfectly, proudly, entirely, deeply, happily, wonderfully, gracefully turn my completely peaceful, incredibly calm, entirely satisfied, absolutely joyful face directly straight, perfectly around today. I look completely, entirely, deeply, beautifully, lovingly straight, directly, perfectly, right at my incredibly handsome, brilliant, successful, wonderfully, absolutely wonderful biological son, Marcus. He is entirely, completely, perfectly, comfortably, right, entirely nearby today, sitting entirely peacefully, completely safely, directly under a massive, beautiful tree. He is entirely, completely, perfectly wearing incredibly comfortable, completely casual, incredibly normal, entirely simple, soft summer clothing, looking completely, absolutely, entirely, perfectly, totally, completely, perfectly, genuinely, entirely, fully happy for the absolutely very first time in his entire life. His incredibly long, highly complex, perfectly, incredibly, deeply heavy, painful life is finally completely peaceful today. He is completely peacefully, wonderfully, perfectly standing, perfectly, entirely, utterly, directly, happily watching his beautiful, bright, incredibly sweet, entirely perfect, totally young, absolutely perfectly beautiful, innocent, small little daughter play happily. She is completely joyfully, entirely happily running, completely safely, wonderfully directly straight, perfectly today. She runs right upon the absolutely soft, incredibly green, completely perfectly warm, entirely completely perfectly safe, absolutely heavily, entirely perfectly, completely manicured, beautiful green grass, entirely today. They are completely safe and completely, utterly, absolutely, finally, totally free today. Far, completely, absolutely, totally, incredibly, perfectly, entirely, incredibly away from this incredibly beautiful, massive, deeply, perfectly warm, incredibly secure, absolutely, totally, absolutely, completely, perfectly safe sanctuary. Chloe is currently terribly working, the incredibly miserable, extremely exhausting, terrible overnight dark shift at a completely local cheap fast food drive-through, completely alone. Her incredibly pale face is entirely, incredibly, extremely perfectly worn. She is heavily, terribly exhausted, completely directly under the incredibly harsh, bright, buzzing, terrible, hot, fluorescent artificial overhead lights today. Her incredibly wealthy, arrogant old money family entirely, completely, officially, publicly disowned her, totally and completely left her with absolutely nothing entirely forever. She entirely sadly hands incredibly greasy, cheap paper food bags directly to incredibly loud, completely rude, angry, impatient, late-night drive-through customers entirely, while wearing a completely cheap, terribly itchy, incredibly ugly, heavily stained polyester fast food uniform. This terrible, cheap, scratchy uniform is completely, heavily, totally covered directly in terribly old, smelly hot, perfectly rancid. It is cooking oil and completely stale, old salty French fry grease today. Her incredibly, perfectly manicured, expensive, completely soft, delicate hands are now entirely, completely, utterly, absolutely, totally ruined, completely, heavily covered in painful hot grease burns and entirely terrible, rough, incredibly painful, completely dry, cracked calluses today. Meanwhile, completely, entirely far away, entirely locked, securely inside a completely, totally freezing, incredibly highly secured, incredibly heavily fortified, entirely massive, extremely dark, terribly maximum security federal prison building. Rochelle is currently absolutely entirely kneeling directly upon a incredibly hard, completely incredibly cold, perfectly, completely entirely solid, terribly damp concrete today. The floor entirely today is freezing. She is entirely, completely, sadly, wearing a completely massive, incredibly heavy, perfectly baggy, terribly itchy, bright orange standard federal prison assigned jumpsuit, entirely aggressively, incredibly, deeply, terribly, intensely, sadly, scrubbing incredibly filthy, terribly, completely disgusting, dirty metal toilets directly inside the incredibly dark, damp, terrifying, completely heavy federal prison ward, completely alone. Her incredibly fake, absolutely entirely arrogant, massive, incredibly wealthy, completely stolen, deeply toxic, entirely perfectly fake empire has been completely, entirely reduced, absolutely entirely, down to a completely miserable, dirty, terribly smelly, cheap plastic yellow cleaning bucket, and entirely, a completely perfectly, she has an incredibly cheap, stiff, completely worn, totally utterly ruined, heavily damaged, small, terribly broken, totally, terribly, absolutely short, incredibly, totally useless, terribly small, toilet scrub brush today. She will absolutely, entirely spend the completely, entire, absolute next 25, incredibly long, incredibly slow, incredibly miserable, incredibly cold, lonely, entirely devastating, incredibly heavy, terribly, completely quiet years, absolutely, entirely, completely, fully breathing, the incredibly, terribly, completely stale, extremely heavy, entirely thick, absolutely, totally, completely dark. Dirty, artificial, incredibly deeply, highly filtered, totally depressing, lonely, terrifying, deeply, absolutely, completely sad air of absolute, total, complete, utter, permanent defeat. Today, perfectly. I stand completely, entirely, perfectly, absolutely, totally, completely, fully tall, completely breathing, incredibly deeply, perfectly, entirely taking, completely, absolutely, utterly, fully, totally, incredibly deep, beautiful, entirely wonderful, completely refreshing breaths of incredibly, completely, deeply, entirely, absolutely clean, entirely fresh, beautiful summer air today. They say time heals all wounds, but that is a lie sold to the weak. Truth is the only thing that heals. They tried to bury me, tried to steal my legacy, my mind, and my own flesh and blood, but they forgot one thing. I am the roots of this tree, completely, permanently, absolutely, firmly, entirely. You cannot break what was built from the soil up. I perfectly raise a beautiful, heavy, clear, massive crystal glass, completely, absolutely, entirely, heavily filled, completely, fully, perfectly, completely, totally, directly, incredibly, wonderfully, beautifully, entirely to the completely, entirely, absolutely, extremely perfect, incredibly lovely, completely, total, beautiful, absolutely lovely, tall, absolute top, entirely, directly, perfectly, with completely, wonderfully, beautiful, sweet, cold, completely authentic, perfectly lovely Southern iced tea. I clink it entirely, perfectly, directly, straight, absolutely directly, incredibly beautifully against the beautiful heavy glass, my incredibly handsome, completely brilliant, wonderful, absolutely, utterly, completely beautifully loving, smart, amazing, entirely successful son. Marcus is currently holding completely safely, tightly, securely, entirely peacefully, happily today. The incredibly bright, entirely warm, absolutely perfectly focused, absolutely lovely, incredibly sharp, completely smooth, highly, entirely wonderful professional, completely, absolutely, utterly, completely, extremely, wonderfully, completely, totally, absolutely, entirely lovely, camera, completely, slowly, perfectly, peacefully, fully, entirely, totally, totally, entirely, pans, perfectly, completely, entirely straight, perfectly, absolutely, beautifully, entirely, totally, fully, directly, safely, right? Perfectly, directly, straight up, completely, directly, perfectly, into the utterly, completely clear, beautiful, entirely, endless, entirely blue, completely gorgeous, entirely, absolute summer sky, entirely, totally, incredibly, perfectly. Today. This upward movement symbolizes ultimate victory completely. It represents total independence and the sweet, absolute taste of justice. Have you absolutely, entirely ever had to completely stand perfectly, incredibly, entirely, absolutely, totally, strongly, entirely tall, completely, totally, incredibly, powerfully, utterly, entirely, completely, strongly, perfectly, firmly, directly, completely, totally, incredibly against entirely fake, completely toxic, incredibly, perfectly, deeply, absolutely, totally terrible, greedy, totally, absolutely, completely terrible, entirely, perfectly, family, completely, entirely, absolutely, completely, totally, members who incredibly, absolutely, incredibly, totally underestimated your completely, incredibly, totally, beautifully, absolutely, deeply, perfectly, entirely perfect, pure, entirely, incredibly, fully, complete, entire worth today. How did you successfully, totally, entirely, gracefully, beautifully? You deeply, completely, fully, proudly, wonderfully, beautifully, completely, totally, perfectly, bravely, incredibly strongly, perfectly, completely successfully, entirely, incredibly, amazingly handle, completely, absolutely successfully, completely, perfectly, entirely, utterly effectively, completely, totally, taking absolutely successfully, entirely, perfectly, beautifully, absolutely, completely, absolutely back your completely perfect, incredibly, perfectly, incredibly, completely beautiful, absolute, lovely, total, absolute, incredibly amazing, totally perfect, deep, strong, absolute, beautiful, lovely power today. I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. Please hit the like button and subscribe. Share with someone who needs this. Your story is beautifully, perfectly, entirely written today, completely happily.